Around 2100 BC in the ancient city of Ur, Sumerian scribes recorded something extraordinary that continues to perplex historians and archaeologists. The texts they inscribed on clay tablets describe not merely the fall of a single city-state, but a catastrophic collapse pattern that had repeated multiple times throughout their recorded history. These weren't simple military defeats or political transitions. The cuneiform accounts detail systematic civilizational breakdown involving environmental catastrophe, social disintegration, and what the texts describe as divine withdrawal that left human societies unable to maintain the sophisticated systems that had sustained them for centuries. The precision with which these collapse narratives document specific phases of decline, the technical terminology they employ for describing infrastructural failure, and the remarkable consistency of collapse patterns across different time periods suggest these texts preserve genuine historical knowledge of civilizational cycles that conventional archaeology has only recently begun to recognize. The most significant collection of these collapse narratives comes from tablets discovered at Nippur between 1888 and 1900 during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions. Among the thousands of fragments catalogued, several groups of texts stand out for their detailed documentation of societal breakdown. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, preserved on multiple tablets, including catalogue number CBS 13856, provides the most comprehensive account of urban collapse from the ancient world. Unlike typical historical chronicles that focus on military events and royal successions, this text systematically documents the breakdown of water systems, agricultural failure, population displacement, and the cessation of temple operations that characterized the end of the third dynasty of Ur around 2004 BC. What makes these Sumerian collapse narratives particularly significant is their technical precision in describing the interconnected failures that led to civilizational breakdown. The texts don't present collapse as sudden catastrophe, but as systematic cascading failure across multiple domains. Environmental changes disrupted agricultural productivity. Resource scarcity triggered social conflict. Administrative systems failed to coordinate responses. Trade networks collapsed. Religious institutions lost their ability to maintain social cohesion. The tablets document each phase with specific details about crop failures, water shortages, migration patterns, and institutional breakdown that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of complex system dynamics. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur represents one of the most detailed accounts of civilizational collapse ever recorded in ancient literature. Composed shortly after the fall of the third dynasty of Ur, around 2004 BC, this text, preserved on multiple cuneiform tablets, provides systematic documentation of the cascading failures that destroyed one of Mesopotamia's greatest urban centers. The lamentation describes not merely military conquest, but comprehensive system breakdown that proceeded through identifiable stages over an extended period. Archaeological excavations at Ur, conducted by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, uncovered physical evidence that corresponds precisely with the collapse sequence described in the tablets, including layers of destruction, evidence of hasty abandonment, and disruption of the water management systems that had sustained the city for over 5 centuries. The text itself survives in multiple copies discovered at various Mesopotamian sites, indicating its importance across the region. The most complete version, catalogued as tablet number 3647 in the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania, contains over 430 lines of carefully inscribed cuneiform text. The literary structure of the lamentation follows a systematic progression through different phases of collapse, beginning with omens and divine warnings, proceeding through environmental deterioration and social breakdown, and culminating in complete urban abandonment. This organizational structure suggests the composers possessed sophisticated understanding of how complex systems fail through interconnected cascading processes rather than single catastrophic events. The lamentation opens with descriptions of ominous signs that preceded the city's fall. The text describes how storms gathered on the horizon, how the gods turned their faces away from their temples, and how the protective deities of the city prepared to depart. While modern readers might interpret these passages as purely religious metaphor, the text's subsequent descriptions of actual physical deterioration suggest these opening passages may encode real environmental and social warning signs that contemporary observers recognized as harbingers of systemic crisis. The departure of the gods, described in elaborate ritual terms, corresponds chronologically with archaeological evidence of reduced temple maintenance and declining votive offerings during the final decades of the dynasty. The middle sections of the lamentation document the progressive breakdown of urban systems in extraordinary detail. The text describes how the irrigation canals that supplied water to the city fields became choked with silt and debris, how the great walls of that had protected the city for generations crumbled from lack of maintenance, how the marketplaces fell silent as trade ceased, how the workshops and craft centres closed their doors, how the temples became empty of worshippers and offerings. Each of these descriptions corresponds to specific archaeological evidence uncovered during the woolly excavations. Layers of silt deposits in ancient canal channels, collapsed sections of the city wall showing evidence of long-term neglect rather than sudden destruction, abandonment of residential and commercial districts, cessation of ritual activity in temple precincts. The lamentation provides remarkably specific information about population displacement during the collapse. The text describes how the people of scattered like frightened birds, how mothers abandoned their children in the chaos of flight, how the elderly were left behind unable to keep pace with younger refugees. Archaeological surveys conducted throughout southern Mesopotamia by Robert McCormick Adams during the 1950s and 60s documented dramatic changes in settlement patterns during the post-Earth 3 period that correspond exactly with these textual descriptions. Large urban sites show evidence of rapid depopulation, while smaller settlements in peripheral areas reveal sudden population increases from refugee influxes. The concluding sections of the lamentation describe the physical state of abandoned in terms that Woolley's excavations confirmed with remarkable precision. The text speaks of how wild animals made their dens in the ruins of temples, how weeds grew in the courtyards where great ceremonies had been performed, how the wind scattered dust through empty streets where merchants had once conducted bustling commerce. The archaeological record shows exactly these conditions. Temple complexes with evidence of animal occupation after human abandonment, wind-blown sand deposits filling architectural spaces, rapid deterioration of unattended structures. The correspondence between textual description and physical evidence demonstrates that the lamentation preserved accurate historical memory of actual collapse conditions, rather than simply employing conventional literary mourning formulas. Most significantly, the lamentation explicitly identifies the interconnection between different failure modes. The text makes clear that agricultural failure led to food shortages that caused population decline, that reduced labour availability for infrastructure maintenance, that accelerated hydraulic system deterioration, that further reduced agricultural productivity in a downward spiral. This understanding of cascading system failures reveals sophisticated grasp of complex system dynamics that modern collapse researchers have only recently begun to appreciate through formal modelling. The ancient Sumerian observers who composed this text recognized that civilizational collapse resulted not from single causes, but from the interaction of multiple reinforcing breakdown processes that exceeded society's capacity for coordinated response. The Sumerian collapse narratives consistently identify environmental changes as the initial trigger for civilizational breakdown. The Curse of Akkad, a text dating to approximately 1900 BC but describing events from 3 centuries earlier, provides specific details about climate shifts that preceded the fall of the Akkadian Empire. The text describes how the regular rains failed to come, how the earth became dry and cracked, and how the grain withered in the fields despite the farmers' best efforts. Paleoclimatic studies of sediment cores from the Persian Gulf and lake deposits throughout Mesopotamia have confirmed that a severe drought event occurred around 2200 BC, precisely corresponding with the collapse period described in the tablets. Dust and pollen analysis from these cores reveals dramatic changes in vegetation patterns and precipitation levels that match the environmental conditions documented in the cuneiform accounts. The Curse of Akkad describes the drought in language that combines religious interpretation with precise environmental observation. The text states that for 7 years, the fields bore no grain, the gardens produced no vines, and the orchards yielded no fruit. While the exact 7-year duration might represent symbolic rather than literal counting, paleoclimatic data confirms that the drought persisted for multiple years rather than representing a single-season failure. Sediment cores from Lake Van in eastern Turkey, analysed by researchers at the University of Miami, show a pronounced dry interval lasting approximately 3 decades, centred on 2200 BC. This extended drought period matches the timescale of the Akkadian collapse described in cuneiform sources. The environmental mechanisms that produced this catastrophic drought have been traced through multiple independent climate proxy records. Marine sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman collected during Ocean Drilling Program Expedition 117 and analysed by Peter de Menocal at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory revealed massive increases in wind-transported dust during the period from 2250 to 1950 BC. The dust particles, analysed through microscope examination and geochemical fingerprinting, originated from exposed lake beds and dried agricultural soils across Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. The quantity of dust preserved in ocean sediments represents the most severe acidification event recorded in the Near East during the past 10,000 years, indicating drought conditions far more extreme than any experienced in the modern instrumental period. Tree ring records from Anatolian juniper specimens preserved in ancient construction timbers provide annual resolution documentation of precipitation changes during the Akkadian collapse period. Dendrochronological analysis conducted by Peter Ian Cuneiform at Cornell University established that annual growth rates declined precipitously, beginning around 2200 BC and remained suppressed for over 3 centuries. The tree ring widths during this period indicate precipitation levels reduced by 40 to 50% compared to preceding and subsequent centuries. This magnitude of precipitation decline would have been absolutely catastrophic for agricultural systems dependent on consistent seasonal rainfall. The agricultural impacts of the drought received detailed documentation in Sumerian administrative texts that survived from the collapse period. Grain ration texts from the final decades of the Akkadian Empire show dramatic reductions in barley allocations to workers, soldiers, and temple personnel. Harvest records from agricultural estates document declining yields that fell to 30 to 40% of normal production levels. Livestock inventories show massive reductions in cattle and sheep herds as pasture lands dried and fodder supplies became inadequate. The administrative precision of these texts, maintained even as the civilization crumbled, provides year-by-year documentation of how environmental deterioration translated into economic crisis. The Curse of Akkad specifically describes how the drought affected the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the lifelines of Mesopotamian civilization. The text states that the rivers no longer provided their accustomed flooding, that the fish disappeared from the waters, and that the boats could no longer navigate the channels. Hydrological modelling based on paleoclimatic precipitation data indicates that river flows during the drought period would have been reduced to approximately 60% of normal volumes. For agricultural systems designed to utilise specific flood patterns and water volumes, even this level of reduction would have required massive adjustments that overtaxed administrative capacity and engineering capabilities. Archaeological evidence reveals how agricultural communities attempted to adapt to deteriorating environmental conditions before ultimately abandoning their settlements. Excavations at Tel Leilan in northern Syria, conducted by Harvey Weiss beginning in 1978, uncovered a thriving agricultural centre that was suddenly abandoned around 2200 BC. The site remained completely uninhabited for 300 years despite having supported a substantial urban population during the Akkadian period. Soil samples from the abandonment layer show dramatic increases in microscopic charcoal particles, indicating that the vegetation cover burned during the extreme drought conditions. Pollen analysis reveals the replacement of agricultural crops and trees with drought-resistant shrubs and grasses characteristic of steppe environments. The physical evidence demonstrates environmental deterioration so severe that continued habitation became impossible regardless of human effort or ingenuity. Similar abandonment patterns appear at sites throughout the Akkadian realm. Tel Brak, Tel Mozan, Tel al-Hawa, and dozens of other urban centres show synchronous abandonment around 2200 BC. The geographical distribution of abandoned sites traces a clear pattern corresponding to the regions most vulnerable to precipitation decline. Northern Mesopotamia, which depended on rainfall agriculture rather than irrigation, suffered complete depopulation. Southern sites with access to river water experienced severe population decline but maintained some habitation. The differential impact of the drought based on water access patterns demonstrates that the environmental crisis was not uniformly catastrophic, but selectively destroyed communities based on their resource vulnerabilities. Sumerian civilization depended entirely on sophisticated irrigation systems that channeled water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to agricultural fields throughout the Mesopotamian plain. The collapse narratives provide detailed descriptions of how these hydraulic systems failed during civilizational breakdown. Tablet CBS 15234 from Nippur describes the silting of canals, the collapse of dikes, and the flooding of fields that occurred as maintenance systems broke down. The text indicates that canal maintenance required continuous coordinated labour involving thousands of workers organised through temple and palace administration. When these administrative systems weakened during the initial phases of collapse, the hydraulic infrastructure quickly deteriorated. Archaeological surveys of ancient canal systems throughout southern Mesopotamia reveal evidence of abandonment and catastrophic failure dating to the collapse periods described in the tablets. The irrigation systems of ancient Mesopotamia represented engineering achievements of extraordinary sophistication. The main canals that diverted water from the Tigris and Euphrates extended for distances exceeding 150 kilometers, requiring precise gradient control to prevent either excessive flow velocity that would cause erosion or insufficient velocity that would allow silt deposition. Distribution networks branched from these primary canals into progressively smaller channels that delivered water to individual field plots. The entire system incorporated flow regulators, settling basins and drainage channels that managed water distribution and prevented waterlogging and salinization. Archaeological surveys conducted by Robert McCormick Adams during the 1950s mapped over 15,000 kilometers of ancient canal traces across southern Mesopotamia, revealing the extraordinary scale of hydraulic infrastructure that sustained Sumerian civilization. The maintenance requirements for this vast hydraulic system exceeded the capacity of individual communities or even single city-states. Administrative texts from Girsu, ancient Lagash, document the labour mobilisation necessary for annual canal maintenance. Tablet collections from the time of King Urukagina, around 2350 BC, describe the organisation of work gangs numbering in the thousands for dredging canals, repairing dikes, and clearing intake structures. The texts specify precise labour allocations, work schedules, and ration distributions that enabled coordination of these massive infrastructure projects. Without centralized administrative systems capable of organizing and provisioning these large labor forces, the maintenance work simply could not be accomplished at the scale required. Archaeological evidence demonstrates exactly what happened when maintenance systems failed during collapse periods. Canal cross-sections excavated at multiple locations show progressive silt accumulation that reduced channel capacity and eventually blocked flow completely. Silt deposition rates calculated from these archaeological sections indicate that without regular dredging, main canals would become non-functional within 5 to 10 years. Distribution channels with smaller cross-sections would fail even more rapidly, potentially within 2 to 3 years of maintenance cessation. The hydraulic system that had taken centuries to construct could deteriorate to uselessness within a single generation once coordinated maintenance ceased. The collapse of irrigation infrastructure created cascading failures across agricultural production systems. Fields dependent on channels that silted first experienced immediate crop failure. Farmers attempted to compensate by redirecting water from still functioning channels, creating conflicts with communities dependent on those same water sources. The disputes over water rights documented in administrative text from the late Ur-III period reflect the intensifying competition for diminishing water resources as the irrigation infrastructure degraded. Without effective arbitration systems and enforcement mechanisms, these water conflicts escalated into armed violence that further disrupted agricultural operations and accelerated social breakdown. Physical evidence of hydraulic system collapse appears in multiple forms across archaeological sites. Abandoned canal channels preserve final silt deposits that contain ceramic fragments, organic remains, and sediment types indicating the precise period of abandonment. Field systems show evidence of hasty abandonment with agricultural tools left in place, and storage structures containing unharvested grain. Settlement patterns reveal sudden shifts as agricultural communities relocated toward remaining functional water sources, creating overcrowding and resource competition in areas that maintained hydraulic access. The archaeological record documents a systematic breakdown of the relationship between water infrastructure and agricultural production that transformed the fertile Mesopotamian plain into a landscape that could no longer support dense urban populations. The repair of failed hydraulic systems after collapse required resources and coordination capabilities that exceeded what fragmented successor states could mobilize. Reconstruction of major canals demanded labor forces comparable to those required for pyramid construction in Egypt. The old Babylonian kingdoms that emerged after the Ur-III collapse never restored the irrigation infrastructure to its former extent. Administrative texts from the Hammurabi period document much more limited canal systems serving smaller agricultural zones, compared to the earlier period. The permanent loss of hydraulic infrastructure capacity meant that post-collapse Mesopotamia could never again support the population densities or urban centres that had characterised the Ur-III period, as environmental conditions deteriorated and agricultural productivity declined. Sumerian texts document increasing competition for diminishing resources that escalated into violent conflict. Administrative tablets from Girsu dating to the final decades of the Ur-III period record disputes over water rights, boundary conflicts between cities, and increasing military expenditures as communities competed for scarce resources. The texts describe how traditional arbitration systems broke down as resource scarcity intensified, leading to armed conflicts that disrupted trade networks and further damaged agricultural infrastructure. Excavations at multiple Sumerian sites reveal evidence of fortification construction, weapon production increases, and destruction layers that correspond with the periods of intensified conflict described in administrative records. The administrative tablets from Girsu provide year-by-year documentation of escalating resource conflicts during the final decades of the Ur-III dynasty. Early texts from the reign of Shulgi, around 2045 BC, record occasional boundary disputes between agricultural communities that were resolved through arbitration by royal officials. These disputes typically involved small plots of land or minor water allocation disagreements that were settled through compromise and compensation. The tone of the text suggests routine bureaucratic processing of normal conflicts within a stable social order that possessed effective mechanisms for peaceful dispute resolution. By the reign of Ibbi-Sin, the final king of the Ur III dynasty around 2020 BC, the character of the conflict documentation changes dramatically. Texts describe water rights disputes that escalated into armed confrontations resulting in casualties. Boundary conflicts expanded from small plots to entire agricultural districts, as communities attempted to control larger territories to compensate for declining productivity on degraded lands. Military expedition records show increasing frequency of punitive campaigns against rebellious provinces that refused to pay tribute or provide labour services to the central administration. The progression from peaceful arbitration to violent conflict, documented across 40 years of administrative records, reveals how resource scarcity systematically undermined the institutions that maintained social order. Archaeological evidence confirms the militarization of Sumerian society during the collapse period. Excavations at Ur revealed construction of massive new fortification walls during the final years of the dynasty. These defences, far more substantial than earlier city walls, incorporated towers at regular intervals, protected gates with complex entry systems, and defensive glacis slopes that enhanced resistance to siege warfare. The investment of resources in military architecture during a period of overall economic decline indicates that defence had become the paramount concern, overriding all other priorities. Similar fortification construction appears at other major Sumerian cities, including Uruk, Nippur, and Lagash, suggesting coordinated response to increased military threats across the entire region. Weapon production evidence reveals the scale of militarization during the collapse period. Bronze weapons, including spearheads, arrowheads, and axe blades, appear in dramatically increased quantities in archaeological deposits from the late Ur III period compared to earlier phases. Chemical analysis of these bronze artifacts reveals standardized alloy compositions, indicating centralized production facilities operating at industrial scale to equip military forces. The quantity of weapons produced exceeded anything required for the professional standing armies that had existed during earlier periods, suggesting mobilization of much larger militias drawn from general populations. This military mobilization diverted productive labour from agriculture and craft production, further reducing economic output and accelerating collapse dynamics. Documentary evidence describes specific military conflicts that devastated agricultural infrastructure and disrupted food production. Texts refer to campaigns by the Elamites from southwestern Iran, who raided deep into Mesopotamian territory, destroying irrigation works and carrying off populations as captives. Internal conflicts between Sumerian city-states fighting over dwindling resources inflicted similar damage. The texts describe how fields were deliberately flooded to deny resources to enemies, how canal systems were sabotaged, and how agricultural workers were killed or displaced. These deliberate attacks on productive infrastructure transformed resource competition into mutually destructive warfare that ensured no parties to the conflicts could maintain viable agricultural systems. The breakdown of trade networks due to military insecurity created additional economic stress that compounded the effects of agricultural decline. Administrative texts document sharp reductions in imports of copper from Magan in modern Oman, timber from the Levant, and precious stones from Afghanistan and the Indus region. These imported materials were essential for craft production, construction, and religious ceremonies that maintained social cohesion and economic vitality. The cessation of long-distance trade isolated Mesopotamian communities from external resources and forced reliance on diminished local production. The texts describe how merchants ceased travelling once roads became unsafe, how ports fell silent when maritime commerce ended, and how craft workshops closed for lack of imported materials. The military conflicts of the collapse period differed fundamentally from earlier wars in Mesopotamian history. Previous conflicts had typically involved limited campaigns with specific political objectives, followed by negotiated settlements and restoration of normal relations. The late Ur-III conflicts show patterns of total war aimed at destroying enemy capabilities rather than achieving limited political goals. This shift to existential warfare reflected the resource scarcity conditions that made coexistence impossible, when the overall economic system could no longer support all existing populations. The archaeological evidence of destruction, the documentary evidence of population displacement, and the subsequent centuries-long abandonment of major urban centres all demonstrate that the late Ur-III military conflicts achieved actual destruction of civilization rather than merely changing political control. The sophisticated bureaucratic systems that coordinated Sumerian society required enormous resources and constant maintenance to function effectively. Collapse narratives describe how administrative systems failed as resource shortages reduced the surplus available to support governmental operations. Tablet collections from Drihem and Pusrish Dagon, the administrative centres that coordinated livestock distribution for the Uthid state, show dramatic declines in transaction volumes during the final decades of the dynasty. The texts reveal that as agricultural productivity fell, the surplus available to support scribes, administrators, and coordination activities diminished proportionally. The bureaucratic systems that had enabled centralized coordination of irrigation maintenance, resource distribution, and conflict resolution simply could not be sustained during resource scarcity conditions. The administrative apparatus of the Ur-III state represented one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic systems ever developed in the ancient world. At its peak during the reign of Shulgi, the system employed thousands of scribes working in coordinated offices throughout the realm. These scribes maintained detailed records of agricultural production, livestock herds, craft manufacturing, labour allocation, and resource distribution that enabled centralised planning and coordination across vast territories. The precision of the record-keeping reached extraordinary levels, with individual sheep being tracked through multiple transfers between herding facilities and grain rations being calculated to daily allocations for individual workers. This bureaucratic sophistication enabled economic optimization and coordination that supported dense urban populations and monumental construction projects. The tablet collections from Drihem and Pusrish Dagon provide unique insight into administrative system collapse, because these sites specialized in livestock management and their records survive in exceptional completeness. The Drihem archives, first excavated systematically during the 1940s and now housed in multiple museum collections worldwide, contain over 100,000 tablets documenting livestock transactions over a 40-year period from approximately 2050 to 2010 BC. Analysis of transaction volumes over time reveals the dynamics of administrative collapse with quantitative precision rarely available for ancient civilizations. During the early years documented in the Drihem archives, the facility processed livestock transactions involving tens of thousands of animals monthly. Sheep, goats, and cattle were received from provincial herding estates, redistributed to temples for sacrifices, allocated to urban populations as rations, and transferred between governmental facilities according to centralized planning directives. The coordination required to manage these livestock flows demanded extensive communication networks, standardized accounting procedures, and hierarchical decision-making systems that functioned with industrial efficiency. The transaction records document a complex economy operating at scale comparable to much later historical periods. Beginning around 2030 BC, transaction volumes at Drihem began declining. Initially, the reduction appeared minor, perhaps reflecting temporary economic adjustments or changes in administrative procedures. However, the decline accelerated through the 2020s BC and became precipitous during the final years of the dynasty. By 2010 BC, transaction volumes had fallen to less than 10% of their peak levels. The administrative records themselves reflect the collapse they document. Earlier tablets display careful script executed by highly trained scribes. Later tablets show increasingly cursive writing, with numerous errors and omissions indicating that the scribal workforce had declined in both numbers and training quality. The final tablets from the site, dating to the last years before 2000 BC, consist of fragmentary records that lack the standardized formats and comprehensive coverage characteristic of earlier periods. The causes of administrative collapse appear clearly in the documentary record when Dreehem livestock data are correlated with agricultural production records from provincial estates. As drought reduced crop yields, less fodder became available for maintaining livestock herds. Herding estates reported declining animal populations as mortality increased and reproduction rates fell. With fewer animals entering the system, the livestock redistribution apparatus that Dreehem coordinated had progressively less material to process. Simultaneously, the agricultural surplus that supported the scribal workforce itself declined. Grain ration texts show reductions in allocations to administrative personnel as overall food availability decreased. Scribal schools trained fewer students as economic conditions deteriorated. The administrative system that depended on agricultural surplus to function was being starved by the same resource constraints that it existed to manage. Administrative collapse created cascading failures across all governmental functions. Without functioning record-keeping systems, taxation and tribute collection became haphazard. Provincial officials lacked central direction and began operating independently or ceased functioning entirely. Labour mobilisation for infrastructure maintenance could not be coordinated across large regions. Resource distribution systems that had equalised surpluses and deficits across different zones failed, creating local famines even where some food remained available. The complex interdependencies that bureaucratic coordination had managed began failing simultaneously as the administrative capacity to coordinate responses disappeared. The archaeological evidence reveals the physical manifestations of administrative collapse. Government buildings show evidence of abandonment with archives left in place, rather than being properly stored or destroyed. In some locations, final occupation layers contain evidence of hasty departure, with valuable tablets scattered rather than organised in the careful arrangements characteristic of functioning archives. Scribal quarters within administrative complexes show declining maintenance and eventual abandonment. The material culture of administrative sites shifts from standardized products, characteristic of organized production, to irregular improvised items suggesting loss of craft specialization and coordination. Most tellingly, the administrative sites themselves were not reoccupied after the collapse. Dreehem remained abandoned permanently despite its strategic location and existing infrastructure. The specialized administrative functions these sites had performed proved unnecessary in the fragmented political landscape that emerged after the Earth-3 collapse. The successor states that divided the former unified realm operated at much smaller scales with correspondingly simpler administrative requirements. The sophisticated bureaucratic systems that had coordinated the Earth-3 state could not be downsized or simplified, but simply ceased to exist when the scale of coordination they provided was no longer possible to maintain. Sumerian civilization participated in extensive trade networks that connected Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Persian Gulf region. Collapse narratives document how these trade systems broke down during civilizational crisis. The Lament for Ur describes how the roads became unsafe for merchants, how the boats no longer travelled the waterways, and how goods from distant lands ceased to arrive at Ur's markets. Administrative texts from Ur show that imports of copper from Magan, timber from the Levant, and precious stones from distant sources all declined sharply in the final years of the dynasty. Without these trade goods, Sumerian craft production declined, further reducing economic activity and the surplus available to support urban populations and governmental functions. The trade networks that sustained Sumerian civilization extended across distances exceeding 3,000 kilometers, connecting Mesopotamia with resource zones throughout the ancient Near East and beyond. Copper essential for bronze production came primarily from Magan, identified with modern Oman on the Arabian Peninsula. Tin required for bronze alloy composition arrived from sources in Afghanistan or Anatolia via complex overland routes. Timber, including cedar and pine necessary for construction and shipbuilding, was imported from the Levant and the Zagros Mountains. Precious stones, including lapis lazuli, carnelian and agate, arrived from Afghanistan, the Indus Valley, and the Persian Gulf region. These imported materials were not luxury items, but essential inputs for craft production, construction, and religious activities that maintained economic vitality and social cohesion. Administrative texts from Ur document the trade flows with quantitative precision that enables detailed analysis of commercial decline during the collapse period. Tablets from the reign of Shulgi record annual copper imports measured in tons arriving at Mesopotamian ports from Magan. Timber import records specify the number of logs, their dimensions, and their allocation to specific construction projects. Precious stone inventories catalogue stones by type, size, and quality grade. This documentary precision creates a detailed baseline against which collapse period changes can be measured with unusual accuracy for ancient economic history. The decline in trade volumes during the final decades of the Ur III dynasty appears dramatically in the administrative record. Copper import texts from the reign of Ibbi-Sin show volumes reduced to approximately 20 to 30% of levels recorded during Shulgi's reign 4 decades earlier. Timber imports declined even more precipitously, with some years showing no recorded deliveries at all. Precious stone acquisitions that had been routine during earlier periods became rare events worthy of special notation. The texts document not gradual adjustment, but catastrophic collapse of commercial systems that had functioned reliably for generations. Multiple factors contributed to trade network breakdown during the collapse period. Environmental deterioration in source regions reduced production of exportable surpluses. The same drought conditions that devastated Mesopotamian agriculture affected surrounding regions, reducing their capacity to produce goods for export. Political instability in intermediary regions disrupted overland trade routes. The texts describe how caravans were attacked by bandits, how merchants were killed or robbed, and how trading stations were abandoned as security conditions deteriorated. Maritime trade faced similar disruptions as piracy increased in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea regions. The breakdown of Mesopotamian purchasing power represented perhaps the most fundamental cause of trade decline. As agricultural productivity fell and administrative systems weakened, Mesopotamian states could no longer generate the surplus resources necessary to purchase imports. The trade system had functioned through exchange of Mesopotamian textiles and agricultural products for imported raw materials. When textile production declined due to reduced wool supplies and craft workshop closures, Mesopotamia had less to offer trading partners. When grain surpluses disappeared, food could no longer be exported to purchase imports. The economic foundation supporting trade simply eroded as the overall Mesopotamian economy contracted. The consequences of trade disruption rippled through the entire Mesopotamian economy. Bronze production ceased or declined dramatically when copper and tin imports stopped arriving. Without bronze, tool production fell, affecting agricultural productivity and craft manufacturing. Construction projects halted for lack of timber, eliminating employment for construction workers and reducing demand for other materials and labour. Craft workshops that had produced prestige goods from imported materials closed, creating unemployment and reducing economic specialization. The texts describe how neighborhoods that had specialized in particular crafts became depopulated as artisans lost their livelihoods and departed seeking opportunities elsewhere. Archaeological evidence confirms the economic impacts of trade disruption documented in the texts. Excavations at craft workshop sites show abandonment during the late Earth III period, With tools left in place and raw materials unused, chemical analysis of bronze artifacts from collapse period contexts reveals declining quality, with irregular alloy compositions indicating scarcity of proper materials. Construction projects show evidence of incompletion, with foundations laid but superstructures never built. The material culture of collapse period sites shows declining diversity and quality compared to earlier periods, reflecting the loss of access to imported materials and the breakdown of specialized craft production. The trade network collapse had political consequences that accelerated overall civilizational breakdown. Control of trade routes and access to imported materials have been major sources of political power and legitimacy for Mesopotamian states. When trade ceased, these power sources disappeared. Provincial governors who had derived wealth and authority from managing trade lost their positions and resources. The central government could no longer reward loyal supporters or purchase military equipment. Political cohesion that had been maintained partly through distribution of exotic trade goods dissolved when those goods became unavailable. The texts describe increasing political fragmentation and rebellion as the economic benefits of political unity disappeared. Most significantly, trade network collapse proved essentially irreversible during the post-collapse period. The successor states that emerged after the earthly fall never restored trade connections to their former extent. The political fragmentation, reduced economic scale, and loss of administrative coordination capacity meant that post-collapse Mesopotamia could not support the long-distance trade systems that had characterized the unified state. Trade continued on much reduced scales, serving local and regional needs, but never recovering the volume and geographical reach of the Ur-3 period. The permanent loss of trade connections represented a permanent reduction in Mesopotamian economic complexity and prosperity. As conditions deteriorated, Sumerian texts document massive population movements as people fled collapsing urban centres seeking survival in less affected regions. The Lament for Ur describes how the city's inhabitants scattered like frightened birds, abandoning their homes and seeking refuge elsewhere. Archaeological surveys throughout southern Mesopotamia reveal dramatic changes in settlement patterns during collapse periods, with large urban sites being abandoned while smaller settlements in peripheral areas show population increases. Analysis of skeletal remains from sites occupied during collapse periods reveals evidence of malnutrition, disease, and violent trauma that correspond with the conditions described in the text documenting social breakdown and population displacement. The scale of population displacement during Mesopotamian collapse periods exceeded anything previously documented in ancient Near Eastern history. Ur, which had sustained populations estimated at 30 to 40,000 inhabitants during the height of the Ur-3 period, was almost completely abandoned by 2000 BC. Archaeological surveys show that the city's residential districts, which had been densely occupied during earlier periods, became depopulated with only scattered occupation in the temple district and near the city walls. Similar patterns appear at other major urban centres including Uruk, Lagash, and Umma, all showing dramatic population reductions during the collapse period. The Lament for Ur provides vivid descriptions of the population exodus that transformed bustling urban centres into ghost towns. The text describes how people fled in panic, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, abandoning homes that had sheltered their families for generations. Mothers are described as leaving children behind in the chaos of flight. The elderly and infirm, unable to keep pace with younger refugees, were left to die in the abandoned city. The dead went unburied as survivors lacked the time and resources for proper funeral rites. These descriptions, while emotionally charged, correspond to archaeological evidence of hasty abandonment and disrupted burial practices during collapse periods. Archaeological surveys conducted by Robert McCormick Adams during the 1950s and 60s documented the destinations of displaced populations with unprecedented comprehensiveness. Adams systematically surveyed settlement patterns across thousands of square kilometres of the Mesopotamian plain, identifying and dating archaeological sites through surface pottery collections and small-scale excavations. His surveys revealed that while major urban centres depopulated during collapse periods, smaller settlements in peripheral areas showed sudden occupation increases. Sites in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, in the Piedmont zones along the Zagros foothills, and in oasis settlements at the desert margins all show evidence of refugee influxes during the late Ur-3 and immediately post-collapse periods. The settlement pattern changes documented through archaeological survey demonstrate that displaced populations sought regions with environmental advantages that provided survival opportunities during crisis conditions. Marshland settlements offered access to fish, waterfowl and reeds that could be harvested without depending on agricultural systems. Piedmont zones received somewhat higher precipitation than the southern plains and supported dry farming in addition to limited irrigation agriculture. Desert oases provided reliable water sources independent of the main river systems whose management had failed. The refugee movements revealed through settlement archaeology show rational adaptation to environmental crisis, with populations relocating to ecological niches that offered better survival prospects. The physical evidence of population displacement extends beyond settlement pattern, changes to include direct indicators of crisis conditions in skeletal remains from collapse period contexts. Bioarchaeological analysis of human remains from sites occupied during collapse periods reveals elevated frequencies of nutritional stress indicators, including growth arrest lines in teeth and bones, periosteal reactions indicating systemic infections, and trauma patterns suggesting increased interpersonal violence. Stable isotope analysis of bone collagen shows dietary shifts consistent with reduced access to agricultural staples and increased reliance on wild resources. The biological data preserved in skeletal remains confirms that displaced populations experience severe nutritional and health stresses, consistent with the catastrophic conditions described in textual sources. Mortality patterns evident in collapse period burial context reveal demographic crises that decimated populations beyond the numbers who successfully relocated. Mass burial context containing multiple individuals interred without normal grave goods or careful positioning appear at several collapse period sites. These burials suggest mortality rates that exceeded the capacity of survivors to perform normal funeral rites for all deceased. Age at death profiles from collapse period cemetery samples show elevated infant and child mortality, consistent with food shortages and disease outbreaks. The skeletal evidence demonstrates that population displacement involved not merely relocation, but massive mortality that reduced overall Mesopotamian population by 50% or more compared to pre-collapse levels. The social disruption caused by massive population movements accelerated civilizational collapse through multiple mechanisms. Traditional social structures based on kinship ties and long-term residence in particular communities dissolved as populations scattered. Agricultural systems dependent on coordinated labour for irrigation maintenance and harvest activities broke down when populations fled. Property rights and land tenure systems that had organised resource access became meaningless when fields were abandoned. The texts describe increasing social chaos as traditional authorities lost legitimacy, and refugees competed violently for resources in their destination regions. The population displacement of the collapse period proved largely irreversible, with major urban centres never recovering their former populations. Post-collapse settlement patterns show continued occupation of the peripheral regions that had received refugee influxes, while the core agricultural zones of southern Mesopotamia remained underpopulated for centuries. The demographic centre of Mesopotamian civilization shifted northward toward Babylon and Assyria, where environmental conditions proved somewhat more favourable. The southern cities that had been the cradle of Sumerian civilization never regained their prominence. The population collapse represented a permanent transformation of Mesopotamian demographic geography that persisted throughout subsequent ancient periods. One of the most distinctive features of Sumerian collapse narratives is their consistent description of divine withdrawal as a crucial factor in civilizational breakdown. The texts describe how the patron deities of cities decided to abandon their earthly residences, leaving human populations without divine protection and guidance. The Lament for Ur provides the most detailed account of this divine withdrawal, describing how Nanna, the moon god and patron deity of Ur, departed from his temple despite the pleas of human devotees. While modern readers might dismiss this as religious interpretation of political events, the consistency with which divine withdrawal appears in collapse narratives across different periods and cities suggests it represented a genuine perception among ancient Mesopotamians that supernatural support systems had ceased functioning during collapse episodes. The theological framework underlying divine withdrawal narratives reveals sophisticated Mesopotamian understanding of the relationship between cosmic order and earthly stability. Sumerian religious thought conceived of cities as earthly residences for deities who chose to dwell among humans and provide protection and prosperity in exchange for worship and offerings. This relationship was not automatic or guaranteed, but depended on continued proper performance of religious obligations by human communities. When communities failed to maintain temples, perform rituals correctly, or provide adequate offerings, deities could withdraw their presence and protection, leaving human populations vulnerable to disaster. The Lament for Ur describes the divine withdrawal process in elaborate detail, spanning multiple sections of the text. The narrative begins with Nanna, patron deity of Ur, receiving notification from the Supreme Divine Council that Ur has been marked for destruction. Nanna protests this decision, arguing that Ur has been faithful and does not deserve such punishment. However, the Divine Council's decision proves irrevocable. Nanna must abandon his temple and depart from the city that has worshipped him for centuries. The text describes Nanna's reluctant departure with imagery of a heartbroken parent forced to abandon beloved children. The consequences of divine withdrawal described in the lamentation extend far beyond symbolic significance to encompass practical failures of systems that humans believed required divine support. With Nanna departed, the protective walls of Ur lose their supernatural strength and crumble before enemy attacks. The irrigation canals that Nanna had blessed cease to flow properly and become choked with silt. The fields that had produced abundant harvests under divine favour now yield only withered grain. The craftsmen who had created beautiful objects inspired by divine muses find their skills departed. Every aspect of civilized life deteriorates following the departure of divine presence. The theological explanation for collapse provided by divine withdrawal narratives served important functions for Mesopotamian society beyond simple religious interpretation. The framework preserved social cohesion by explaining catastrophic failure without destroying legitimacy of fundamental institutions. The collapse was not the fault of kingship as an institution, administrative systems as organizational forms, or agricultural techniques as technologies. Rather, specific failures of religious observance had caused divine displeasure. By preserving the fundamental validity of institutional structures while explaining their failure through theological mechanisms, the narratives enabled eventual restoration attempts based on the same institutional models. Archaeological evidence provides interesting correlations with the divine withdrawal described in textual sources. Temple complexes show evidence of reduced maintenance and declining votive offerings during the final decades before collapse. At Ur, the Nanna Temple precinct reveals that major construction and renovation projects ceased during the later reign of Ibbi-Sin. Votive offerings deposited in temple contexts decline in both quantity and quality during the same period. While these changes likely resulted from economic decline reducing resources available for temple support, the correlation with textual descriptions of divine withdrawal is striking. The archaeological evidence could equally be interpreted as showing that humans stopped supporting temples, or that deities stopped accepting offerings. The consistency of divine withdrawal narratives across multiple collapse episodes suggests this represented an established theological interpretation pattern rather than unique explanation for specific events. City laments from different periods and locations all describe patron deities abandoning their cities before catastrophic destruction. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, the lamentation over Nippur, and the lamentation over Eridu all employ similar narrative structures depicting divine departure, followed by urban catastrophe. This consistency indicates that Mesopotamian theological thought included well-developed frameworks for understanding civilizational collapse in divine withdrawal terms. Modern scholarly interpretation of divine withdrawal narratives tends to treat them as religious packaging for political and economic processes that ancient observers could not analyse in secular terms. From this perspective, the narratives represent ancient attempts to make sense of complex system failures using the conceptual frameworks available within Mesopotamian cultural traditions. However, this interpretation may underestimate the sophistication of ancient understanding. The divine withdrawal narratives demonstrate clear recognition that civilizational stability depends on maintaining proper relationships between multiple interconnected systems, that collapse results from cascading failures across these systems, and that responsibility for maintaining systemic health falls on human communities who must perform the necessary activities, whether framed as religious obligations or secular administration. The practical impact of divine withdrawal beliefs on human behaviour during collapse episodes remains difficult to assess but potentially significant. If populations genuinely believed that divine protection had been withdrawn, this perception could have influenced decisions about whether to remain in threatened cities or flee to new locations. The texts describe how knowledge of divine departure spread panic that accelerated population flight. Whether divine withdrawal narratives cause behavioural changes that worsened collapse, or merely describe perceptions that arose from observing collapse processes remains unclear, but the consistency and prominence of these narratives indicates they played important roles in how ancient Mesopotamians experienced and understood civilizational breakdown. Sumerian temples served as far more than religious institutions. They functioned as economic centres coordinating agricultural production and resource distribution, educational institutions training scribes and administrators, astronomical observatories maintaining calendars and predicting celestial events, and social centres providing cohesion for urban communities. Collapse narratives document how temple operations ceased during civilizational breakdown, creating cascading failures across multiple social domains. The Lament for Ur describes how the daily offerings ceased, how the festivals were no longer celebrated, how the temple workshops fell silent, and how the scribal schools closed their doors. Administrative tablets from Nippur show that temple operations contracted dramatically during collapse periods, with massive reductions in personnel, cessation of construction activities, and abandonment of subsidiary facilities throughout temple estates. The multifunctional nature of Mesopotamian temples made them central to virtually every aspect of urban civilization. The major temple complexes at cities like Ur, Uruk and Nippur each controlled extensive agricultural estates, employed thousands of workers, operated craft workshops producing textiles and metal goods, maintained scribal schools that trained the literate elite, conducted astronomical observations that regulated the calendar, and provided venues for festivals and ceremonies that reinforced community identity. The temples were not peripheral religious institutions, but core economic and social infrastructure that coordinated production, distribution, education, timekeeping, and social cohesion. The economic functions of temples received detailed documentation in administrative archives that survived from major temple establishments. The archive from the Nana Temple at Ur contains thousands of tablets documenting the temple's economic activities during the Ur III period. These texts record agricultural production from temple estates measured in hundreds of thousands of litres of grain annually, livestock herds numbering in tens of thousands of sheep and goats, textile production involving hundreds of weavers producing thousands of garments per year. the scale of temple economic activities exceeded that of many royal establishments, making temples major economic actors whose continued operation was essential for overall economic vitality. The educational role of temples in training scribes and administrators made them crucial for reproducing the literate elite necessary for governmental functions. Scribble schools operated within major temple complexes, providing instruction in cuneiform writing, mathematics, literature, and administrative procedures. Students spent years mastering the complex cuneiform script and the extensive literary tradition that included mythology, hymns, historical chronicles, and practical texts. The scribal curriculum preserved and transmitted the knowledge base that enabled sophisticated administrative systems to function. When temple schools closed during collapse periods, the pipeline for training new scribes broke, ensuring that literacy and administrative capabilities would decline in subsequent generations. The astronomical functions of temples enabled the maintenance of accurate calendars essential for coordinating agricultural activities and religious observances. Temple astronomer priests conducted systematic observations of celestial phenomena, including lunar phases, planetary positions, and stellar risings. These observations enabled prediction of seasonal timing crucial for agricultural planning. Temple astronomical activities also maintained the religious calendar that scheduled festivals and ceremonies throughout the year. The astronomical knowledge developed and maintained within temple establishments represented sophisticated technical achievement that required institutional continuity for preservation and transmission. The social cohesion functions of temples operated through festivals, ceremonies, and daily rituals that brought communities together in shared activities. The major festivals celebrated at urban temples attracted participants from throughout the city and surrounding region. These gatherings reinforced social bonds, displayed community wealth and power, and provided entertainment and social interaction opportunities. The daily temple rituals, while attended by limited numbers, symbolize the continued operation of the cosmic order and the maintenance of proper relationships between human and divine realms. When temple activities ceased, communities lost these cohesion mechanisms and social solidarity weakened. The collapse of temple operations received systematic documentation in the Lament for Ur. The text describes how daily offerings to Nana ceased when resources became unavailable to support continued ritual activities. Annual festivals were not celebrated as the economic surplus and social conditions necessary for elaborate ceremonies disappeared. The temple workshops where craftsmen had produced offerings, cult objects, and trade goods fell silent as raw materials became unavailable and skilled workers departed. The scribal school closed its doors when resources to support students and teachers evaporated, and demand for trained scribes declined with contracting administrative systems. Each cessation cascaded into further failures across interconnected social systems. Administrative tablets from Nippur provide quantitative documentation of temple operational decline during collapse periods. Personnel rosters from the Enlil temple complex show workforce reductions of 70 to 80% during the final decades of the Ur III period. Ration texts document corresponding reductions in resource allocations to remaining temple workers. Construction accounts show that major building projects ceased with some structures left incomplete. Agricultural production records from temple estates show declining output and eventual abandonment of outlying properties. The systematic contraction evident across all domains of temple operations demonstrates comprehensive institutional failure. The cessation of temple operations eliminated the coordinating mechanisms that had organized significant portions of Mesopotamian economic and social life. Agricultural production, previously coordinated through temple estates, fragmented into smaller uncoordinated units with reduced efficiency. Resource redistribution mechanisms that temples had provided disappeared, creating local scarcities even where regional surpluses might have existed. Educational systems that had trained literate administrators ceased functioning, ensuring skill loss in subsequent generations. Astronomical observations became less systematic, degrading calendar accuracy. Social cohesion weakened as communities lost shared ritual activities. Most significantly, temple collapse proved difficult to reverse during attempted reconstruction periods. The successor states that emerged after the Earth collapse never fully restored temple operations to their previous scale and complexity. Post-collapse temples operated with smaller staffs, controlled fewer resources, and provided fewer services compared to their Earth predecessors. The permanent reduction in temple institutional capacity represented permanent loss of coordination mechanisms that had enabled high levels of social complexity. The civilization that eventually recovered after collapse operated at reduced complexity levels, precisely because key institutions, including temples, never recovered their full previous capabilities. While Sumerian collapse narratives do describe military invasions and conquests, careful analysis reveals that foreign military action typically occurred after internal collapse processes were already well advanced, rather than serving as the primary cause of civilizational breakdown. The Curse of Akkad describes how the Gutians, tribal people from the Zagros Mountains, invaded Mesopotamia during the Akkadian collapse. But the text makes clear that this invasion succeeded because the Akkadian state had already been severely weakened by internal problems. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Destruction layers at Akkadian sites show evidence of abandonment and decay before the final destruction events, indicating that the cities were already in decline when foreign invasions delivered the final blow. The role of military invasion in collapse episodes represents one of the most commonly misunderstood aspects of ancient civilizational breakdown. Popular narratives often portray collapse as resulting from conquest by external enemies who militarily overwhelm previously strong states. However, detailed analysis of both textual and archaeological evidence reveals a different pattern. Foreign invasions typically succeeded not because invading forces possessed overwhelming military superiority, but because defending states had already been catastrophically weakened by internal failures. The military conquest were consequences rather than causes of collapse, delivering final destruction to civilizations that had already lost the capacity for effective resistance. The Curse of Akkad provides the clearest textual evidence for this relationship between internal collapse and external invasion. The text describes the Akkadian collapse in explicit stages. First, the god Enlil withdraws divine protection from the Akkadian capital in response to Naram-Sin's desecration of Enlil's temple at Nippur. This divine withdrawal triggers environmental catastrophe with the cessation of seasonal rains and the onset of severe drought. Agricultural failure follows, with fields producing no grain and orchards yielding no fruit. Famine spreads throughout the realm. Economic breakdown accelerates as trade ceases and craft production halts. Social order dissolves as starving populations turn to violence. Only after this complete internal disintegration do the Gutians invade from the Zagros Mountains. The text makes explicit that the Gutian invasion succeeded because Akkadian defences had already collapsed. The invaders are described as lacking proper warfare training, possessing inferior weapons, and having no knowledge of civilized governance. Under normal circumstances, such primitively organized forces could never have threatened the sophisticated Akkadian military with its professional armies, fortified cities, and advanced weapons. However, by the time the Gutians arrived, the Akkadian state possessed none of these advantages. The armies had dissolved as soldiers deserted or died from starvation. The fortifications stood unmanned as urban populations had fled. The weapons arsenals lay empty as bronze production had ceased for lack of imported copper. The Gutian invasion succeeded not through military prowess, but through moving into a power vacuum created by complete internal collapse. Archaeological evidence from Akkadian period sites confirms this sequence of internal decay preceding final destruction. Excavations at Tel Brak in northeastern Syria revealed occupation through the Akkadian period, followed by abandonment around 2200 BC. The abandonment layer shows no evidence of violent destruction. Rather, the site displays gradual decay, with structures deteriorating from lack of maintenance before eventual abandonment. Only in upper levels deposited after the main abandonment does evidence of burning and destruction appear, indicating that violent destruction occurred after the city had already been largely depopulated. Similar patterns appear at Tel Leilan, Tel Mozan, and other Akkadian centres showing abandonment, followed by later destruction, rather than destruction causing abandonment. The stratigraphic evidence demonstrates that Akkadian cities experienced extended periods of decline before final destruction events. At Tel Brak, the sequence shows normal Akkadian occupation with substantial buildings and rich material culture. This is followed by a phase of declining maintenance, with structures deteriorating and material culture becoming impoverished. Then comes abandonment with buildings left empty and decay proceeding unchecked. Finally, after an interval of abandonment, burning layers indicate that the ruins were destroyed, presumably by hostile forces. This sequence proves conclusively that internal decline and abandonment preceded external destruction by enough time for substantial decay to occur. The pottery evidence from Akkadian collapse context provides additional chronological precision regarding the relationship between internal decline and external destruction. Ceramic assemblages from the final Akkadian occupation phases show continuation of normal Akkadian pottery types with high-quality production. Standards. Subsequent abandonment layers contain Akkadian pottery types, but with declining production quality and fewer vessel forms indicating economic contraction. Post-abandonment destruction layers contain both degraded Akkadian pottery and new pottery types associated with invading groups, confirming that invaders arrived after Akkadian civilization had already collapsed. The ceramic sequence demonstrates that economic decline, abandonment, and invasion occurred as distinct sequential phases rather than simultaneous events. The settlement pattern evidence across northern Mesopotamia reveals that the Gutian presence in the region followed rather than caused the abandonment of Akkadian urban centres. Archaeological surveys show that Gutian period settlements appear as small pastoral camps rather than urban centres, located in regions where Akkadian cities had previously existed but had been abandoned. The Gutians were occupying territory that had been depopulated rather than conquering inhabited lands. Their settlement pattern reflects pastoral adaptation to post-collapse conditions rather than establishment of territorial control through military conquest. The Gutians were filling an ecological niche that Akkadian collapse had created rather than militarily displacing Akkadian populations. The administrative texts from the transition period between Akkadian and post-Akkadian periods reveal that the Gutian presence was gradual infiltration rather than sudden invasion. Early post-collapse texts mention Gutians as raiders and bandits attacking trade caravans and isolated settlements rather than armies conquering fortified cities. Over time, Gutian presence increased as pastoral groups moved into regions where agricultural populations had declined or disappeared. Eventually, Gutian leaders established themselves as rulers over some recovering urban centres, not through military conquest, but through providing the minimal governance that was better than complete anarchy. The textual evidence shows gradual infiltration into a collapsed landscape, rather than military invasion of functioning civilization. The pattern of internal collapse followed by external infiltration or invasion appears consistently across multiple Mesopotamian collapse episodes. The Earth recollapse followed by Elamite raids and Amorite migrations, the Old Babylonian collapse, followed by Kassite infiltration, the Late Bronze Age collapse followed by Aramaean movements. In each case, detailed analysis reveals that external groups gained control over Mesopotamian territories after internal systems had already failed rather than causing the initial failure through military action. The consistency of this pattern demonstrates that external military threats were symptoms rather than causes of civilizational collapse, succeeding only when internal vulnerabilities had already destroyed defensive capabilities. One of the most tragic aspects documented in Sumerian collapse narratives is the loss of knowledge and technological capability that accompanied civilizational breakdown. The texts describe how the wisdom of the scribes was forgotten, how craft secrets were lost, and how technologies that had been maintained for centuries disappeared within a few generations. Administrative tablets show dramatic declines in literacy rates during collapse periods, with fewer scribes being trained and simpler record-keeping systems replacing the sophisticated bureaucratic documentation of earlier periods. Archaeological evidence reveals technological regression in multiple domains, including metallurgy, architecture, and agricultural technique, with post-collapse societies demonstrating capabilities substantially inferior to those of their predecessors, despite having access to the same natural resources. The loss of literacy represents perhaps the most measurable and catastrophic knowledge loss during Mesopotamian collapse periods. Literacy in ancient Mesopotamia was never universal, but remained concentrated among scribal elites who underwent years of specialized training to master the complex cuneiform writing system. The scribal schools that trained these elites operated within major temple complexes and palace establishments, requiring substantial institutional support and resources to function. When economic conditions deteriorated during collapse periods, scribal training programs contracted dramatically as institutions could no longer afford to support the lengthy education process that produced literate administrators. The quantitative evidence for literacy decline appears clearly in the administrative record itself. During the peak of the Ur-3 period under King Shulgi and Amarsin, administrative archives preserved tens of thousands of tablets, annually documenting routine bureaucratic transactions. The sheer volume of documentation demonstrates that large numbers of trained scribes were actively producing records throughout the realm. The tablets themselves display sophisticated script executed by highly trained professionals who had mastered not only the mechanics of cuneiform writing, but also the complex accounting procedures, legal formulations, and literary conventions necessary for administrative work. By contrast, the administrative record from the post-collapse Isin-Larsa period shows dramatic quantitative and qualitative decline. The total volume of administrative documentation decreases by approximately 80 to 90% compared to Ur-3 levels. The tablets that do survive show declining script quality, with irregular sign forms, increased spelling errors, and simplified accounting procedures. Many tablets from this period display features characteristic of student work or inexperienced scribes, suggesting that professional training standards had collapsed. The documentary evidence demonstrates not merely reduction in administrative activity, but degradation of the skills and knowledge necessary to maintain sophisticated record-keeping systems. The loss of literary knowledge represents another dimension of the literacy collapse. During the Ur-3 period, scribal training included extensive literary education, with students copying and memorizing hundreds of lines of classical Sumerian literature, including myths, hymns, proverbs, and historical chronicles. This literary tradition preserved cultural memory, provided shared reference points for educated elites, and maintained linguistic competence in classical Sumerian, even as spoken language evolved. The collapse of scribal schools disrupted literary transmission, with many classical texts disappearing from the active repertoire during post-collapse periods. When literary activity eventually recovered during the Old Babylonian period, scribes had to reconstruct texts from fragmentary sources or oral traditions, resulting in altered versions that differed substantially from their Ur-3 predecessors. Technological regression in metallurgy provides clear archaeological evidence of capability loss during collapse periods. Bronze production requires sophisticated knowledge of ore processing, smelting temperatures, alloy ratios, and casting techniques that were developed through generations of accumulated experience. During the Earthly period, Mesopotamian bronze smiths produced standardized tools and weapons with consistent alloy compositions, typically 90% copper and 10% tin, that provided optimal combinations of hardness, durability, and workability. Chemical analysis of bronze artifacts from Ur-3 contexts shows remarkable consistency in alloy compositions, indicating quality control and standardized production procedures. Post-collapse bronze artifacts show significant degradation in metallurgical quality. Chemical analysis reveals highly variable alloy compositions with tin content ranging from 3% to 20%, even within artifact collections from single sites. This variability indicates loss of the standardized knowledge that had enabled consistent alloy production. Some post-collapse bronzes incorporate inappropriate additives including lead or arsenic, suggesting that smiths were experimenting or substituting materials without understanding proper metallurgical principles. The physical properties of post-collapse bronzes show corresponding degradation with increased brittleness, reduced durability, and inferior edge retention compared to Ur-3 products. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that not merely the scale, but the quality of bronze production declined catastrophically during the collapse period. Architectural regression appears equally dramatic in the building techniques documented through archaeological excavation. Ur-3 monumental architecture incorporated sophisticated engineering including complex drainage systems, foundations designed to distribute loads across unstable soils, and wall constructions that resisted settlement and cracking. The ziggurat at Ur built during the reign of Ur-Nammu demonstrates engineering capabilities that included calculating proper foundation depths, designing drainage systems that prevented water damage, and constructing massive walls that remained stable despite their enormous weight. The precision of the construction and its durability over 4 millennia demonstrate sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. Post-collapse construction shows dramatic simplification of building techniques with loss of many sophisticated elements that had characterized earlier architecture. Foundations become shallower and less carefully prepared. Drainage systems disappear or become crude and ineffective. Wall constructions show less attention to stability and durability. Buildings from the Isin-Lhasa period typically required major repairs or reconstruction within decades of initial construction, whereas Ur-3 buildings often remained functional for centuries. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that builders had lost not merely the resources, but the knowledge necessary to construct buildings to earlier standards. Agricultural technique regression appears in multiple forms. Across the post-collapse period, Ur-3 agricultural administration incorporated sophisticated crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility while maximizing production. Administrative texts describe multi-year fallow cycles, strategic use of legume crops to restore nitrogen, and careful management of irrigation intensity to control salt accumulation. These techniques represented accumulated knowledge developed through centuries of agricultural experience under Mesopotamian environmental conditions. Post-collapse agricultural texts show abandonment of these sophisticated techniques in favor of simpler intensive cultivation methods that provided short-term yields but degraded soil quality more rapidly. The knowledge loss in agricultural practice contributed to reduced long-term productivity that prevented population recovery to pre-collapse levels. The mechanisms of knowledge loss operated through multiple pathways that reinforced each other during collapse periods. The closure of scribal schools directly eliminated the institutional structures through which literacy and technical knowledge were transmitted. The death or displacement of skilled craftsmen during collapse episodes physically removed the practitioners who possessed technical expertise. The breakdown of specialized production systems destroyed the organizational context within which technical knowledge was applied and maintained. The economic contraction reduced demand for sophisticated products, eliminating the market incentives that had sustained specialized skills. Each of these pathways contributed to comprehensive knowledge loss across multiple domains. The irreversibility of knowledge loss represents one of the most important features of Mesopotamian collapse. Once knowledge disappeared from active practice and institutional transmission, its recovery required not merely restoration of economic conditions, but rediscovery or reinvention of lost capabilities. Some knowledge systems were eventually reconstructed during recovery periods, but typically required generations or centuries and often achieved only partial restoration of previous capabilities. Other knowledge was permanently lost with post-collapse civilizations, never recovering certain sophistications that their predecessors had achieved. The permanent component of knowledge loss meant that civilizations emerging from collapse started from reduced capability baselines and faced barriers to achieving previous complexity levels. The Sumerian historical record documents not a single collapse event, but multiple episodes of civilizational breakdown occurring at regular intervals throughout Mesopotamian history. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BC, the fall of the Third Dynasty around 2004 BC, and the subsequent breakdown of the Old Babylonian period around 1600 BC all show remarkably similar patterns of environmental stress, administrative failure, social conflict, and eventual political collapse. This cyclical pattern suggests that Mesopotamian civilizations were inherently vulnerable to specific types of systemic stress that repeatedly triggered similar collapse processes, despite significant differences in political organization and cultural context between different periods. The recognition that Mesopotamian history followed cyclical patterns rather than linear progression represents relatively recent scholarly achievement. Earlier historiography tended to view ancient Near Eastern history as a succession of distinct civilizations rising and falling independently. However, systematic analysis of archaeological and textual evidence accumulated over the past century reveals clear patterns of repeated collapse and recovery cycles that affected the entire Mesopotamian region simultaneously. These cycles followed sufficiently regular patterns in their causes, processes, and consequences that they appear to reflect structural vulnerabilities inherent in Mesopotamian civilization, rather than random historical accidents. The Akkadian collapse around 2200 BC represents the earliest well-documented major collapse episode. As previously described, this collapse involved severe drought triggering agricultural failure, administrative breakdown, population displacement, and eventual political disintegration. The Akkadian Empire, which had unified Mesopotamia under centralized rule for over a century, fragmented into competing smaller states, urban centers depopulated, trade networks collapsed, literacy declined, technological capabilities degraded. The recovery period lasted approximately 150 years before stable political organization re-emerged with the establishment of the Ur-3 dynasty around 2100 BC. The Ur-3 collapse around 2004 BC followed patterns remarkably similar to the Akkadian collapse 2 centuries earlier, despite significant differences in political organization and cultural context. The Ur-3 state had developed more sophisticated administrative systems than its Akkadian predecessor, with more extensive bureaucratic documentation and more complex economic coordination. However, when environmental stress appeared in the form of renewed drought conditions, the more complex Ur-3 systems proved equally vulnerable to cascading failure. Agricultural productivity declined, administrative systems contracted, social conflict intensified, population displacement occurred, foreign groups infiltrated weakened territories. The collapse sequence matched the Akkadian pattern despite 2 centuries of political and administrative evolution. The Old Babylonian collapse around 1600 BC repeated the cycle yet again. The Old Babylonian period had seen recovery from the Ur-3 collapse with political reunification under Hammurabi, reconstruction of administrative systems, and restoration of trade networks. The famous law code of Hammurabi demonstrates sophisticated legal and administrative thinking that appeared to have learned from previous collapse episodes. However, when stress conditions appeared, including environmental deterioration, military pressures, and economic problems, the Old Babylonian state collapsed following patterns similar to its predecessors. Agricultural systems failed, administrative coordination broke down, urban centres depopulated, literacy declined. Foreign groups, including Kassites, gained control over Mesopotamian territories. The recovery from this collapse proved even longer than previous episodes, with political stability not returning until the establishment of the Kassite dynasty centuries later. The regularity of these collapse cycles reveals underlying structural vulnerabilities that persisted across different political and cultural contexts. All three major collapse episodes involved environmental stress, particularly drought, as a triggering mechanism. All three featured administrative system failure, as centralized coordination proved unable to maintain function during resource scarcity. All three included intensified social conflict over diminishing resources. All three resulted in population displacement and urban abandonment. All three produced knowledge loss and technological regression. The consistency of these patterns across centuries and different political systems indicates they resulted from fundamental features of Mesopotamian civilization rather than specific policy failures or random events. The environmental trigger mechanism appears particularly consistent across collapse cycles. Paleoclimatic data reveals that all three major collapse episodes coincided with severe drought events documented in multiple independent climate proxy records. The droughts were not identical in severity or duration, but all exceeded the adaptive capacity of Mesopotamian agricultural systems. The consistent appearance of drought as a collapse trigger reflects the fundamental vulnerability of Mesopotamian civilization to water availability. The irrigation-based agricultural systems that enabled high productivity during normal conditions became catastrophic vulnerabilities during drought periods when river flows decreased and rainfall failed. The administrative vulnerability appears equally consistent across cycles. All three Mesopotamian states that collapsed had developed sophisticated, centralized administrative systems that enabled economic coordination across large territories. However, these administrative systems required substantial resource surpluses to maintain their extensive bureaucracies, communication networks, and enforcement mechanisms. When environmental stress reduced agricultural productivity and eliminated economic surplus, the administrative systems lost their resource base and contracted rapidly. The tightly coupled nature of administrative coordination meant that partial failures cascaded into complete system breakdown. The sophistication of administrative systems proved to be a source of vulnerability rather than resilience. The social conflict pattern shows remarkable consistency across collapse cycles. Resource scarcity triggered competition between communities, regions, and social classes. Traditional arbitration mechanisms failed as conflicts intensified. Military expenditures increased consuming resources needed for productive activities. Infrastructure damage from warfare accelerated economic decline. Population displacement disrupted social structures. Each collapse cycle featured escalating violence that transformed manageable resource allocation problems into existential struggles that destroyed social cohesion. The cyclical pattern raises important questions about whether post-collapse societies learned from previous experiences and attempted to build more resilient systems. The documentary evidence suggests that Mesopotamian civilization maintained historical memory of previous collapses through texts like city laments and chronicles that were copied for centuries after the events they described. Scribal education included these historical texts, ensuring that literate elites knew about previous collapse episodes. Legal codes like Hammurabi's laws show efforts to address problems that had contributed to previous breakdowns. However, despite this historical awareness, subsequent civilizations proved unable to prevent repetition of collapse cycles when similar stress conditions appeared. The failure to break the collapse cycle despite historical awareness suggests that the vulnerabilities were deeply embedded in the fundamental organization of Mesopotamian civilization. The dependence on irrigation agriculture in an arid environment with high climate variability, the development of complex hierarchical administrative systems with high coordination requirements, the dense urban populations dependent on agricultural surpluses from distant hinterlands, the extensive trade networks vulnerable to disruption. These features enable the sophistication and prosperity of Mesopotamian civilization during normal conditions, but created systemic vulnerabilities that became catastrophic during stress periods. Reforming these fundamental features would have required transforming the basic character of the civilization, something that proved impossible without abandoning the features that had made the civilization successful in the first place. The Curse of Akkad presents one of the most theologically sophisticated explanations for civilizational collapse in ancient literature. The text, preserved on multiple tablets dating to the Old Babylonian period, describes how Naram-Sin, the fourth ruler of the Akkadian dynasty, offended the chief god Enlil by desecrating his temple at Nippur. In response, Enlil decreed the destruction of the Akkadian Empire, withdrawing divine protection and summoning the Gutian invaders to devastate Mesopotamia. While modern historians interpret this as a theological explanation constructed after the fact to explain the Akkadian collapse, the text provides valuable insights into how ancient Mesopotamians understood the relationship between proper religious observance, divine favour, and political stability. The systematic theology of divine punishment developed in this text influenced Mesopotamian political thought for over 1,000 years. The narrative structure of the Curse of Akkad follows a clear theological logic that explains collapse as direct consequence of human transgression against divine order. The text begins by describing the prosperity and power of the Akkadian Empire under its early rulers. Sargon, the dynasty founder, receives divine favour and establishes an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. His successors maintain this prosperity through proper religious observance and respect for divine authority. The empire reaches its zenith under Naram-Sin, who achieves military victories throughout the known world and brings unprecedented wealth to Akkad. However, Naram-Sin commits a catastrophic error by attacking the Ekur temple of Enlil at Nippur. The text describes this desecration in vivid detail. Naram-Sin enters the sacred precinct with his troops. He demolishes walls and gates using battering rams. He defiles the inner sanctuary. He steals precious metals and sacred objects. He destroys cult statues and religious furnishings. The motivation for this sacrilege remains unclear in the text, though some scholars interpret it as response to oracles that failed to support Naram-Sin's military ambitions, or as attempt to assert royal authority over priestly power. Regardless of motivation, the desecration of Enlil's temple represents ultimate transgression against divine authority. Enlil's response demonstrates the power of divine retribution to destroy even the mightiest human achievements. The text describes Enlil summoning the divine council and decreeing that Akkad must be utterly destroyed as punishment for Naram-Sin's sacrilege. Enlil withdraws his divine protection from the Akkadian realm and pronounces a curse that encompasses every aspect of civilized life. The agricultural lands will become desert, the cities will be abandoned, the people will be scattered. The kingship will pass to foreign hands, the name of Akkad will be forgotten. The comprehensiveness of the curse reflects the totality of divine power over human affairs. The execution of Enlil's curse unfolds through the mechanisms previously described in discussing the Akkadian collapse. Environmental catastrophe strikes as rain ceases and drought devastates agricultural lands. The text employs powerful imagery, describing how the once fertile fields become cracked wasteland, how the irrigation canals run dry, how the grain withers before it can be harvested. Social breakdown follows with starving populations turning to violence and desperation. Trade ceases as merchants refuse to travel dangerous routes. Craft production halts as raw materials become unavailable. Urban populations flee seeking survival in peripheral regions. The systematic destruction of every element of civilized life demonstrates the totality of divine punishment. The climax of the curse comes with the Gutian invasion. Enlil summons these tribal people from their mountain homeland and commands them to devastate Mesopotamia. The text describes the Gutians in terms emphasizing their alien character and lack of civilized attributes. They are compared to beasts who know neither human speech nor proper governance. They wear skins rather than proper garments. They eat uncooked food. They have no knowledge of farming, crafts, or cities. Yet these primitives succeed in conquering the mighty Akkadian Empire because Enlil has withdrawn divine protection from Mesopotamia. The contrast between civilized Akkadians and barbarian Gutians emphasizes that military capability matters less than divine favor in determining political outcomes. The theological framework developed in the Curse of Akkad served multiple functions in Mesopotamian political thought. Most obviously, it explained catastrophic collapse in terms that preserved the legitimacy of fundamental institutions. The collapse resulted not from flaws in kingship, administration, or technology, but from specific royal transgression against divine authority. Proper religious observance and respect for temples could prevent repetition of such disasters. This theological explanation enabled institutional continuity by defending the basic structures of Mesopotamian civilization while explaining their periodic failures. The text also established clear parameters for legitimate royal authority. Kings derived their power from divine mandate, and that mandate could be withdrawn if rulers violated divine prerogatives. The desecration of temples, disrespect for priesthoods, or neglect of religious obligations could trigger divine punishment. This theological framework provided religious establishments with powerful rhetorical weapons for resisting royal encroachment on priestly privileges. Kings who threatened temple property or authority could be warned that they risked Naram-Sin's fate. The Curse of Akkad thus functioned as political theology that defined boundaries of legitimate royal power. The influence of the Curse of Akkad on subsequent Mesopotamian political thought appears in multiple ways. Later royal inscriptions consistently emphasize piety and temple construction as primary royal duties. Kings proclaim their devotion to gods, their generous support of temples, and their careful observance of religious obligations. These proclamations reference the theological framework established in texts like the Curse of Akkad that connected divine favor with political stability. When subsequent collapses occurred, similar theological explanations were developed attributing disasters to royal impiety or divine displeasure. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur follows narrative patterns similar to the Curse of Akkad, even though the specific historical circumstances differed substantially. The modern scholarly interpretation of the Curse of Akkad recognizes that the text was composed long after the Akkadian collapse it describes, probably during the Old Babylonian period over 3 centuries later. The historical Naram-Sin may not actually have desecrated Enlil's temple at Nippur as the text claims. Instead, the narrative may represent a theological interpretation constructed retrospectively to explain the collapse in terms consistent with Mesopotamian religious thought. However, this later composition does not diminish the text's value for understanding how Mesopotamians conceptualize collapse. The Curse of Akkad reveals the cultural frameworks through which ancient observers made sense of catastrophic civilizational failure and the theological explanations that provided meaning to otherwise inexplicable disasters. Excavations at Akkadian period sites throughout Mesopotamia have provided extensive physical evidence confirming the collapse described in texts like the Curse of Akkad. Tel Leilan in northern Syria, extensively excavated by Harvey Weiss between 1978 and 1987, shows clear evidence of sudden abandonment around 2200 BC following a severe drought event. The site remained unoccupied for 300 years despite having been a major urban centre during the Akkadian period. Soil samples from the abandonment layer show dramatic increases in windblown dust indicating arid conditions, while pollen analysis reveals sharp declines in agricultural vegetation. Similar patterns appear at other Akkadian sites including Tel Brak, Tel Mosen and Tel Tyre, all showing evidence of rapid depopulation during the same narrow time window. Tel Leilan provides the most comprehensive archaeological documentation of Akkadian collapse conditions due to the extensive excavations conducted over multiple decades and the excellent preservation of environmental evidence at the site. The Akkadian period occupation at Tel Leilan, known locally as Shubat Enlil, covered approximately 90 hectares and supported an estimated population of 15 to 20,000 inhabitants. The city featured monumental architecture including temples, palaces and administrative buildings. Residential districts contained houses with sophisticated layouts and substantial construction. Craft workshops produced ceramics, textiles and metal goods. The material culture indicates prosperous urban centre fully integrated into Akkadian imperial networks. The collapse sequence at Tel Leilan appears with unusual clarity in the stratigraphic record. The final Akkadian occupation layer shows normal urban activities continuing up to the moment of abandonment. Houses contain domestic assemblages with cooking vessels, storage jars, and personal possessions left in place. Workshops preserve tools and raw materials abandoned mid-production. Administrative buildings contain tablets documenting routine bureaucratic activities. The archaeological evidence indicates that abandonment occurred suddenly, without the gradual decline that might have allowed organised departure with the removal of valuable possessions. Above the final Akkadian occupation layer lies an abandonment deposit approximately 40 centimetres thick, consisting primarily of wind-blown sediments with no evidence of human activity. Soil analysis of this abandonment layer reveals its composition differs dramatically from both underlying Akkadian period soils and overlying later deposits. The abandonment layer contains substantially elevated concentrations of aeolian dust particles, indicating that wind erosion and dust deposition dramatically increased during the abandonment period. Chemical analysis of the sediments shows characteristics consistent with dried agricultural soils being transported by wind from exposed fields where vegetation cover had disappeared. Pollen analysis of samples from the abandonment layer provides direct evidence of vegetation change consistent with severe drought. Akkadian period samples show pollen assemblages dominated by cultivated cereals and trees, indicating active agriculture and managed landscapes. The abandonment layer shows dramatic decline in agricultural pollen types and corresponding increases in drought-tolerant shrubs and grasses characteristic of steppe vegetation. The pollen data demonstrates that agricultural landscapes transformed into arid grasslands during the abandonment period, a change that could only result from severe precipitation decline making farming impossible. The duration of the Tel Leilan abandonment can be estimated through multiple lines of evidence. The thickness of the abandonment layer and its sediment accumulation rate suggest the site remained unoccupied for approximately 3 centuries. Ceramic evidence confirms this estimate, with the pottery types appearing in reoccupation layers above the abandonment deposit belonging to styles that developed 300 years after the final Akkadian wares. Radiocarbon dates from organic materials in the abandonment layer, and overlying deposits provide absolute chronology, confirming 3-century hiatus in occupation. The extended abandonment duration indicates that environmental conditions remained unsuitable for urban occupation for multiple generations after the initial drought-triggered collapse. Tel Brak, located approximately 100 kilometres northeast of Tel Leilan, shows virtually identical abandonment patterns during the same time period. Excavations directed by David Oates and later Joan Oates revealed a substantial Akkadian period city that was suddenly abandoned around 2200 BC. The abandonment layer contains similar aeolian sediments and shows similar pollen evidence for vegetation change. The duration of abandonment matches Tel Leilan at approximately 3 centuries, The synchronous abandonment of these major urban centres, located 100 kilometres apart, demonstrates that the collapse affected the entire region simultaneously, rather than representing local problems at individual sites. Tel Mozan, ancient Urkesh, provides additional confirmation of regional collapse patterns. Excavations by Giorgio Bucciolati and Marilyn Kelly Bucciolati revealed Akkadian period occupation followed by abandonment during the collapse period. The site shows evidence of Hurrian occupation continuing after Akkadian collapse, but at substantially reduced scale, indicating that even populations that survived the collapse experienced severe reduction in urban complexity. The Tel Mozan evidence demonstrates that the collapse affected not only Akkadian imperial centres, but also allied or subject cities throughout northern Mesopotamia. The geographical distribution of abandoned Akkadian sites traces the environmental boundaries of the drought's most severe impacts. Northern Mesopotamia, dependent on rainfall agriculture, experienced complete urban abandonment. Southern Mesopotamian sites with access to irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates maintained some occupation, though at greatly reduced scales. The differential survival based on water access confirms that drought severity determined collapse outcomes. Sites that could maintain water supplies through irrigation survived, though diminished, while sites dependent on rainfall were completely abandoned for centuries. The archaeological evidence from multiple excavated sites thus provides comprehensive confirmation of the collapse described in textual sources. The sudden abandonment, the environmental evidence of severe drought, the extended duration of abandonment, and the synchronous timing across multiple sites all match the textual descriptions of catastrophic collapse triggered by environmental disaster. The archaeological and textual evidence converge to document one of the most severe civilizational collapses recorded in human history. Paleoclimatic research has provided increasingly precise documentation of the severe drought events that preceded major collapse episodes in Mesopotamian history. Sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman analysed by Peter Domenical and colleagues revealed massive increases in wind-blown dust dating to precisely 2200 BC, indicating catastrophic drought conditions across the entire Near East. The dust peaks in these cores represent the most severe aridification event of the past 10,000 years in this region. Similar evidence appears in lake sediment cores from Turkey, speleothem records from Iranian caves, and Dead Sea level reconstructions, all showing coordinated drought conditions across the entire Near Eastern region during the Akkadian collapse period. The temporal precision of this climate data and its perfect correspondence with textual accounts of collapse eliminates any doubt that environmental factors played a crucial role in triggering civilizational breakdown. The marine sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman provide the most comprehensive paleoclimatic record documenting the Akkadian collapse drought. These cores were collected during Ocean Drilling Program Leg 117, which recovered continuous sediment sequences spanning the past 150,000 years from multiple sites in the Arabian Sea and Gulf of Oman. The cores preserve annual to decadal resolution records of environmental conditions throughout the Near East through analysis of various climate proxy indicators preserved in the sediments. The dust content of marine sediments provides direct measurement of aridity conditions in adjacent terrestrial regions during dry periods. Vegetation cover declines and soil surfaces become exposed to wind erosion. Dust particles eroded from exposed soils are transported by winds and eventually deposited in ocean sediments. The quantity of dust preserved in marine sediments thus directly reflects the extent of land surface aridity and vegetation, decline in upwind source regions. Marine cores from the Gulf of Oman receive dust primarily from Mesopotamia and surrounding Near Eastern regions, making them ideal archives of regional climate conditions. Analysis of dust content in the Gulf of Oman cores reveals dramatic variations in aridity over the past 10,000 years. Most of the Holocene period shows moderate dust levels consistent with semi-arid conditions that could support agriculture and urban civilization. However, at approximately 2200 BC, dust content increases by over 300% within a time interval of less than 50 years. This dust peak persists for approximately 300 years before declining back to normal levels. The magnitude and duration of this dust spike indicates unprecedented aridity that transformed the entire Near Eastern region into a dust source comparable to modern extreme deserts. The mineralogical composition of dust particles preserved in the marine cores enables identification of their source regions. X-ray diffraction analysis of dust mineral assemblages shows that the 2200 BC dust spike contains minerals characteristic of Mesopotamian alluvial soils. Scanning electron microscope examination of dust particles reveals morphological features indicating they originated from dried agricultural lands rather than natural desert regions. The dust composition evidence confirms that the marine dust spike resulted from erosion of formerly agricultural landscapes that had been abandoned due to drought. The timing of the marine dust spike matches archaeological evidence of Akkadian collapse with remarkable precision. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials in sediment cores bracketing the dust spike yields ages of 2200 plus or minus 50 years BC. This chronological precision results from the high sedimentation rates in the Gulf of Oman, which create thick sediment sequences with excellent temporal resolution. The correspondence between marine dust, spike timing and archaeological abandonment dating confirms the causal connection between environmental disaster and civilizational collapse. Additional climate proxy evidence from lake sediment cores throughout the Near East provides independent confirmation of the severe drought documented in marine records. Lake Van in eastern Turkey contains a continuous sediment sequence spanning the past 20,000 years. Analysis of oxygen isotope ratios and carbonate minerals precipitated from lake water reveals variations in precipitation and evaporation balance over time. The oxygen isotope record from Lake Van shows dramatic shift toward more positive values at 2200 BC, indicating either reduced precipitation or increased evaporation consistent with severe drought conditions. The isotope shift persists for approximately 3 centuries, matching the duration of the dust spike in marine cores. Speleothem records from caves in northern Iran provide additional high-resolution climate data. Stalagmites growing in caves incorporate oxygen isotopes from precipitation that reflect regional climate conditions. Annual growth bands in stalagmites enable precise dating of climate variations. Analysis of stalagmites from Golizard Cave by researchers at the University of Miami revealed dramatic reduction in stalagmite growth rates at 2200 BC, indicating severely reduced precipitation. Some stalagmites show complete cessation of growth during this interval, indicating that cave drip water stopped flowing entirely. The speleothem evidence confirms that precipitation declined to levels insufficient to sustain normal hydrological cycling. Dead Sea level reconstructions provide yet another independent measure of regional climate conditions. The Dead Sea occupies a closed basin with water levels determined by the balance between river inflows and evaporative losses. During wet periods, river inflows increase and lake levels rise. During dry periods, inflows decrease and evaporation causes lake levels to fall. Geomorphological evidence of past Dead Sea shorelines enables reconstruction of historical lake levels. Studies by Mordecai Stein and colleagues at the Geological Survey of Israel documented dramatic Dead Sea level decline beginning around 2200 BC, with lake levels falling approximately 50 meters below previous stands. This massive level decline indicates that river inflows into the Dead Sea drainage basin, primarily the Jordan River, decreased dramatically due to regional precipitation decline. The convergence of evidence from multiple independent climate archives located across different parts of the Near East demonstrates that the drought was not a localized phenomenon but affected the entire region simultaneously. Marine sediment cores, lake records, cave deposits, and sea level data all show coordinated changes at the same time, indicating response to regional climate forcing. The spatial extent of the drought encompassed the entire area from Turkey through Mesopotamia to the Levant and Arabia, affecting every agricultural system in this vast region. The magnitude of the climate change documented in these various records exceeds anything experienced in the Near East during the modern instrumental period. Quantitative climate reconstructions based on the paleoclimate proxy data suggest that precipitation declined by 40 to 50% compared to long-term average values. Summer temperatures increased by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. The combination of reduced precipitation and increased evaporation created hydrological deficit that completely overwhelmed the adaptive capacity of ancient agricultural systems. The climate data demonstrates that Akkadian civilization faced environmental stresses of severity unprecedented in human experience of the region. The duration of the climate anomaly, approximately 300 years, explains why recovery from the Akkadian collapse required such extended periods. As long as drought conditions persisted, agricultural systems could not be re-established at scales necessary to support urban populations and complex administrative systems. Only after climate conditions eventually returned to normal weather patterns could agricultural productivity recover sufficiently to enable urban regeneration. The climate data thus explains not only the initial collapse, but also the extended dark age that separated Akkadian civilization from its Ur-3 successor. The match between climate anomaly duration and archaeological abandonment duration provides compelling evidence that environmental factors determine the entire arc of collapse and recovery. The centuries following the collapse of the Ur-3 dynasty demonstrate how Mesopotamian society fragmented into competing smaller states, unable to restore the centralized coordination that had characterized earlier periods. The Isin-Lhasa period, lasting from approximately 2004 to 1795 BC, saw political power divided between multiple city-states including Isin, Lhasa, Babylon, Eshnunna, and Ashur, none of which could establish lasting hegemony over the entire region. Administrative tablets from this period show continued economic activity and cultural production, but at substantially reduced levels compared to the Ur-3 period. The fragmentation itself becomes evidence of how collapse destroyed not just political institutions, but the underlying social and economic structures that had enabled large-scale political integration. The political geography of the Isin-Lhasa period contrasts dramatically with the unified territorial state that had characterized the Ur-3 dynasty, where a single royal administration had coordinated activities across all of southern Mesopotamia. Now multiple independent kingdoms competed for territory, resources, and political supremacy. Isin, located in central Mesopotamia, initially claimed to be the legitimate successor to Ur-3 authority, and controlled significant territories in the immediate post-collapse period. Lhasa, situated in southern Mesopotamia near ancient Uruk, established an independent kingdom that eventually grew to rival Isin's power. Babylon, which would later achieve dominance, began as a relatively minor city-state during the early Isin-Lhasa period. Eshnunna in the Diyala region and Ashur in northern Mesopotamia controlled their own territories and pursued independent policies. The military conflicts between these competing states consumed resources that might otherwise have supported economic recovery and prevented any single power from achieving the territorial integration necessary to restore Ur-3 scale coordination. Chronicles from the Isin-Lhasa period document continuous warfare between rival kingdoms. Isin and Lhasa fought repeatedly over control of southern cities including Uruk, and Nippur. Eshnunna contended with Isin for control of trade routes leading to Iran. Babylon gradually expanded its territory through military campaigns against neighboring states. The endemic warfare created insecurity that disrupted trade, damaged agricultural infrastructure, and diverted labour from productive activities to military service. Administrative tablets from Isin Lhasa period sites reveal the reduced scale of governmental operations compared to Ur-3 predecessors. The royal archives from Isin contain far fewer tablets than comparable Ur-3 archives despite covering similar time spans. The surviving texts document simpler administrative procedures, with less detailed accounting and fewer hierarchical levels of oversight. Transaction volumes recorded in Isin tablets represent fractions of the volumes processed through Ur-3 administrative centres, like Drihem and Pusrish-Daegen. The quantitative reduction in administrative documentation reflects both reduced economic activity and simplified bureaucratic systems that could not maintain Ur-3 levels of complexity. The economic activities documented in Isin Lhasa administrative texts show continued function of basic Mesopotamian economic systems, but at reduced sophistication and scale. Agricultural production continued with temples and palaces managing estates and collecting revenues. Craft production operated with workshops producing textiles, ceramics, and metal goods. Trade networks functioned connecting Mesopotamian cities with external regions. However, all these activities operated at scale substantially smaller than during the Ur-3 period. Agricultural estates controlled by Isin temples encompassed hundreds rather than thousands of hectares. Craft workshops employed dozens rather than hundreds of workers. Trade volumes measured in individual shipments rather than the systematic flows documented in Ur-3 records. The literacy and scribal culture of the Isin Lhasa period demonstrates both continuity with earlier traditions and significant degradation of capabilities. Scribal schools continue to operate in major cities, training administrators in cuneiform writing and traditional literary culture. The literary texts composed during this period show that classical Sumerian literature remained part of scribal education. However, the quality and quantity of literary production declined compared to the Ur-3 period. Fewer literary compositions were created. The texts that were produced often show simplified language and less sophisticated literary techniques. The scribal training system functioned but at reduced capacity and with diminished standards. The religious and cultural life of Isin Lhasa period cities maintained traditional Mesopotamian patterns, while adapting to reduced resources. Temples continued to function as religious centres with daily rituals, festivals, and ceremonies. Kings continued to legitimise their rule through temple construction and support for religious institutions. However, the scale of religious activities contracted substantially. The massive building projects that had characterised royal patronage during the Ur-3 period gave way to smaller construction efforts. Temple personnel numbers declined as reduced resources limited institutional capacity to support large staffs. Festival celebrations continued, but with reduced elaboration and smaller participant numbers. The fragmentation of political authority during the Isin Lhasa period created conditions that prevented restoration of the coordination mechanisms that had enabled Ur-3 civilization to function at high complexity levels. Irrigation system maintenance that had been coordinated across entire river basins during the Ur-3 period now depended on cooperation between competing states that often had conflicting interests. Major canal systems that crossed territorial boundaries received inadequate maintenance as rival kingdoms failed to coordinate labour mobilisation. Agricultural productivity suffered as hydraulic infrastructure degraded without coordinated maintenance efforts. Trade networks faced similar coordination problems during the Isin Lhasa period. Long-distance trade required security along extended routes that crossed multiple political jurisdictions. Competing kingdoms often disrupted trade to damage rivals' economies or refused to cooperate in maintaining trade infrastructure. Merchants faced increased risks from bandits, arbitrary taxation, and political interference. The volume of long-distance trade declined substantially compared to Ur-3 levels, as transaction cost increased and security decreased. The reduced trade volumes meant that Mesopotamian cities had less access to imported materials including metals, timber, and luxury goods that were essential for craft production and elite consumption. The succession of short-lived dynasties at Isin demonstrates the political instability that characterized the period. The Essene dynasty, established by Ishbi-Erra in the immediate aftermath of Ur III collapse, initially controlled substantial territories in central and southern Mesopotamia. However, successive Essene kings gradually lost territory to rival kingdoms, particularly Larsa. The Essene king list records 14 rulers over approximately 225 years, with several showing evidence of contested successions or brief reigns suggesting political instability. The final Essene rulers controlled only the city itself, and immediate surroundings, having lost most of the kingdom's original territory. Larsa's rise to dominance over southern Mesopotamia during the later Essene-Larsa period demonstrates how military success could enable territorial expansion, but not necessarily political consolidation at earthly scales. King Rim-Sin of Larsa, ruling from 1758 to 1798 BC, conquered Isin and established Larsa control over most of southern Mesopotamia. However, Rim-Sin's kingdom remained substantially smaller than the Ur III state, and continued to face challenges from Babylon and other rivals. The Larsa kingdom demonstrated that military conquest could create regional dominance, but not the stable territorial integration that had characterized earlier unified periods. The inability of any Essene-Larsa period state to achieve lasting unification of all Mesopotamia reveals how collapse had destroyed not merely political institutions, but the underlying conditions that had made large-scale integration possible. The population decline resulting from collapse had reduced the demographic base available for labour mobilisation and military forces. The degradation of irrigation infrastructure had reduced agricultural productivity, limiting the surplus available to support centralised administration. The knowledge loss had reduced administrative capabilities, making complex bureaucratic coordination more difficult. The fragmentation of political authority had created vested interests in continued division, as regional elites benefited from autonomous control over their territories. Each of these factors made restoration of Earth III-scale political integration increasingly difficult as the post-collapse period extended. The Old Babylonian period, beginning with Hammurabi's unification of southern Mesopotamia around 1792 BC, represented an attempt to restore the centralized coordination systems that had collapsed with the Ur III dynasty. Hammurabi's famous law code, preserved on a massive stone stele discovered at Susa in 1901, demonstrates systematic effort to re-establish legal order and administrative coordination across the reunified territory. The code's emphasis on regulating water rights, agricultural practice, and commercial transactions reveals awareness that collapse had disrupted the informal coordination mechanisms that had previously governed these activities. Despite these restoration efforts, administrative tablets from the Old Babylonian period show that bureaucratic complexity and coordination capabilities never fully recovered to Ur III levels. Hammurabi's unification of southern Mesopotamia required decades of military campaigns against rival kingdoms including Larsa, Eshnunna, Mari, and various smaller states. The military success that enabled territorial consolidation depended partly on Hammurabi's diplomatic skills in forming and dissolving alliances that isolated targets one at a time. Letters from the Mari archives provide detailed documentation of diplomatic maneuvering during Hammurabi's expansion, showing how he manipulated alliance systems to achieve military advantages. The eventual conquest of all major rivals by Hammurabi's 35th regnal year established Babylon as the dominant power in Mesopotamia for the first time. The law code promulgated by Hammurabi represents the most systematic attempt to restore legal and administrative order following the collapse period fragmentation. The stele containing the law code, originally erected in Babylon but later carried to Susa as war booty, stands over 2 meters tall with the legal provisions inscribed in approximately 4,000 lines of cuneiform text. The prologue emphasizes Hammurabi's divinely ordained role as king of justice, tasked with establishing right and equity throughout the land. The epilogue threatens curses on any future ruler who might alter the legal provisions or fail to administer justice according to the code's principles. The substantive provisions of Hammurabi's code address the full range of social, economic, and administrative issues that required regulation in Mesopotamian society. Property rights, commercial transactions, agricultural practices, family relations, criminal offences, and administrative procedures all receive detailed treatment. The code's organisation reflects systematic attempt to create comprehensive legal framework that could guide administrative and judicial decision-making across diverse situations. The level of detail and comprehensiveness suggest awareness that informal customary practices that had regulated behaviour during earlier stable periods required formal codification after collapse had disrupted traditional mechanisms. The extensive provisions regarding water rights and irrigation management in Hammurabi's code reveal particular concern with agricultural coordination problems. Multiple sections address responsibilities for canal maintenance, with severe penalties for negligence that damages irrigation infrastructure. Provisions specify compensation requirements when one farmer's water management failures harm neighbouring fields. Regulations establish procedures for coordinating labour mobilisation for major hydraulic works. The code's attention to irrigation issues demonstrates recognition that agricultural productivity depended on effective coordination of water management, and that such coordination required legal frameworks that could compel cooperation. Agricultural practice provisions in the code address problems of land tenure, rental arrangements, and productivity expectations that had become contentious during the fragmentation period. Regulations establish standardized rental rates for agricultural land, specify obligations of tenant farmers and landlords, and provide mechanisms for resolving disputes over crop divisions and land improvements. Provisions address what happens when agricultural lands are damaged by natural disasters or military actions, establishing principles for sharing losses between different parties. The agricultural regulations reveal systematic effort to create predictable framework for agricultural production that could support economic recovery. Commercial transaction provisions demonstrate concern with re-establishing trust and coordination in economic activities. Regulations specify requirements for commercial contracts, establish procedures for resolving disputes between merchants, and define penalties for fraud or breach of contract. Provisions address credit arrangements including interest rates, collateral requirements, and debt collection procedures. Regulations establish standards for wages and prices in various industries. The commercial provisions reveal understanding that economic recovery required legal frameworks that enabled market transactions while protecting participants from exploitation and fraud. Despite Hammurabi's ambitious legal and administrative reforms, quantitative analysis of Old Babylonian administrative texts reveals that bureaucratic systems never recovered to 3 levels of complexity and capability. Administrative archives from Old Babylonian Babylon and other cities contain substantially fewer tablets than comparable 3 archives. The accounting procedures documented in Old Babylonian texts show less detail and fewer hierarchical oversight levels than 3 systems. Transaction volumes recorded in Old Babylonian archives represent fractions of 3 period volumes, even accounting for differences in archive survival rates. The scribal culture of the Old Babylonian period shows both continuity with traditional education and inability to fully restore earlier capabilities. Scribal schools operated in major cities with standardized curricula that included literary texts, mathematical exercises, and practical administrative training. The literary production of the Old Babylonian period actually exceeded that of the Ur-3 period in some respects, with major works including the Epic of Gilgamesh being composed or compiled during this era. However, the administrative scribal workforce appears to have been substantially smaller than during the Ur-3 period, with fewer professional administrators managing governmental operations. The economic scale of Old Babylonian states remained substantially below Ur-3 levels despite political reunification. agricultural estates controlled by palace and temple establishments encompassed smaller territories than their Year 3 predecessors. Craft production operated at reduced scales with smaller workshops and fewer specialized producers. Trade networks functioned but never recovered the volume and geographical extent of Ur 3 period commerce. The reduced economic scale meant that Old Babylonian states generated smaller surpluses available to support administrative operations, military forces, and construction projects. The irrigation infrastructure of Old Babylonian period southern Mesopotamia never fully recovered from the degradation suffered during the collapse and fragmentation periods. Archaeological surveys of ancient canal systems reveal that many major canals documented from the Ur 3 period were never restored to full operation during the Old Babylonian period. Some regions that had supported dense agricultural settlement during Ur 3 times remained sparsely populated. Throughout the Old Babylonian period, indicating that agricultural productivity could not be restored to previous levels, the permanent reduction in irrigated agricultural area meant that Old Babylonian states operated with smaller agricultural bases than their Ur 3 predecessors. The military challenges faced by Old Babylonian states reveal continuing vulnerabilities despite political reunification. Hammurabi's successors faced increasing pressure from external groups, including Kassites from the Zagros Mountains and Amorite tribes from the Syrian desert. These pressures eventually overwhelmed Old Babylonian defences, with Babylon being sacked multiple times during the 16th century BC. The Old Babylonian dynasty finally ended around 1600 BC, when Kassite invaders established control over southern Mesopotamia. The inability to maintain effective defences despite Hammurabi's restoration efforts demonstrates that the Old Babylonian state never achieved the resilience and power projection capabilities that had characterized successful earlier dynasties. Later Mesopotamian literature demonstrates that cultural memory of collapse episodes persisted for centuries, influencing historical understanding and political thought long after the original events. Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian royal inscriptions frequently reference the ancient disasters that had befallen previous dynasties, using them as cautionary examples and sources of political legitimacy. Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh contained copies of ancient collapse narratives, including the Curse of Akkad and various city laments, indicating that these texts remained important for educating royal scribes and administrators. The preservation and continued copying of these texts across more than 1,000 years demonstrates that Mesopotamian civilization maintained active historical consciousness of its cyclical pattern of rise and collapse. The preservation of ancient collapse narratives in royal libraries demonstrates institutional commitment to maintaining historical memory across multiple political transitions and cultural transformations. Ashurbanipal, who ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire from 668 to 627 BC, assembled one of the ancient world's most comprehensive libraries at his capital Nineveh. The library contained approximately 30,000 tablets covering virtually every domain of Mesopotamian knowledge, including literature, history, science, magic, and administration. Among these texts were multiple copies of the Curse of Akkad, various city laments, and other compositions describing ancient collapses that had occurred over 1,000 years before Ashurbanipal's time. The inclusion of ancient collapse narratives in royal library collections served multiple functions beyond historical preservation. These texts provided educational materials for training scribes and administrators who would manage imperial operations. The collapse narratives functioned as case studies, demonstrating how civilizations fail when proper practices are neglected. Royal scribes studying these texts learned about the consequences of administrative failures, the importance of maintaining religious obligations, and the vulnerabilities that could trigger systemic breakdown. The educational use of collapse narratives made historical consciousness a practical tool for governance, rather than merely antiquarian interest. Royal inscriptions from Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods demonstrate how collapse narratives influenced political rhetoric and legitimation strategies. Kings frequently referenced ancient disasters as warnings about the consequences of improper governance while portraying their own reigns as successfully avoiding such fates. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe how he restored temples and cities that had been destroyed in ancient times, implicitly claiming that his piety would prevent repetition of past disasters. Nebuchadnezzar II's inscriptions emphasize his massive construction projects rebuilding Babylon and other cities as reversing the decay that had resulted from earlier collapses. The political use of collapse narratives created rhetorical frameworks that shaped how rulers justified their policies and projected their power. The literary tradition of composing new city laments for contemporary disasters demonstrates how ancient collapse narrative forms remained actively productive. When Neo-Assyrian armies destroyed cities during imperial campaigns, literary compositions mourning these destructions employed narrative patterns and literary formulations derived from ancient Sumerian laments. The lamentation over the destruction of Babylon, composed after the city's conquest by Sennacherib, in 689 BC follows narrative structure similar to the ancient lamentation over the destruction of Ur despite the millennium separating these compositions. The continuity of literary forms across such extended periods demonstrates how deeply collapsed narratives were embedded in Mesopotamian cultural consciousness. Historical chronicles compiled during Neo-Babylonian and later periods demonstrate systematic efforts to maintain comprehensive records of past political events, including collapses. The Babylonian chronicles, preserved in multiple copies from the Hellenistic period, provide year-by-year accounts of major political events spanning centuries of Mesopotamian history. These chronicles include entries describing the Akkadian collapse, earthly fall, and various intermediate disasters. The chronicle format's matter-of-fact tone contrasts with the emotional intensity of city laments, but serves similar function of preserving historical memory of systemic failures. The existence of these different literary genres for recording collapse demonstrates that Mesopotamian civilization employed multiple approaches to maintaining historical consciousness. The influence of ancient collapse narratives on Mesopotamian historical thought extended beyond specific textual traditions to shape fundamental concepts about the nature of political power and civilizational stability. The recurring pattern of rise and fall documented in multiple collapse episodes became foundational to Mesopotamian historical understanding. Rather than viewing history as linear progress toward greater sophistication, Mesopotamian thinkers recognized cyclical patterns where even successful civilizations eventually declined and collapsed. This cyclical view of history shaped political expectations and administrative practices with awareness that present prosperity could not be taken for granted. The theological frameworks developed in ancient collapse narratives continued to influence religious and political thought throughout Mesopotamian history. The concept that divine favor was necessary for political stability and could be withdrawn for religious transgressions remained central to Mesopotamian political theology. Kings across all subsequent periods emphasized their piety and temple patronage as essential aspects of legitimate rule. Religious establishments maintained power to challenge royal policies by invoking the collapse precedents where divine displeasure had destroyed kingdoms. The theological interpretation of collapse thus became a permanent feature of Mesopotamian political culture. The practical lessons derived from collapse narratives influenced administrative policies and institutional structures throughout later Mesopotamian history. Awareness that irrigation system maintenance was crucial for preventing agricultural collapse led to sustained attention to hydraulic infrastructure even during politically troubled periods. Recognition that administrative coordination required substantial resource investment led to continued support for scribal education and bureaucratic institutions. Understanding that trade disruption could trigger economic breakdown motivated efforts to maintain commercial networks and security along trade routes. The practical application of collapse lessons demonstrates that historical consciousness functioned as more than cultural tradition, but actively shaped governance practices. The geographic distribution of libraries and schools containing collapse narratives reveals how widely this historical knowledge spread throughout Mesopotamian civilization. Major cities throughout the Assyrian and Babylonian empires maintained libraries with copies of ancient texts, including collapse narratives. Provincial centres educated local elites in traditional literature that included historical accounts of systemic failures. The widespread distribution of this knowledge ensured that awareness of collapse patterns permeated Mesopotamian civilization, rather than remaining restricted to royal courts or central temples. The democratization of historical knowledge created shared cultural understanding of civilizational vulnerability. The transmission of Mesopotamian collapse narratives into later cultural traditions demonstrates the enduring influence of these historical memories beyond Mesopotamian civilization itself. Hebrew traditions incorporated elements from Mesopotamian collapse narratives, particularly flood traditions that parallel Mesopotamian deluge accounts. Greek historians, including Herodotus, drew on Mesopotamian historical traditions when describing ancient Near Eastern kingdoms. The preservation of Mesopotamian historical consciousness through these transmission processes ensured that awareness of ancient collapses influenced Western historical thought even after Mesopotamian civilization itself had ended. The collapse patterns documented in Sumerian texts show remarkable similarities to civilizational breakdowns in other ancient societies, suggesting common vulnerability factors across different cultural contexts. The Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC that destroyed the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece and Egyptian New Kingdom power show similar patterns of environmental stress, trade disruption, population displacement, and cascading system failures. The classic Maya collapse around 900 AD demonstrates nearly identical sequences of drought, agricultural failure, warfare intensification, and political fragmentation, despite occurring in completely different geographical and cultural settings. These parallels suggest that complex civilizations share common structural vulnerabilities that make them susceptible to similar collapse triggers regardless of specific cultural characteristics. The Late Bronze Age collapse that destroyed multiple civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East between 1300 and 1150 BC provides the most extensively documented parallel to Mesopotamian collapse patterns. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Mycenaean palace societies in Greece, New Kingdom Egypt, and various Levantine kingdoms all experienced severe disruptions or complete collapse within a narrow time window. Archaeological evidence reveals that major cities were destroyed, writing systems disappeared, trade networks broke down, and population levels declined dramatically across this entire region. The synchronous timing and similar collapse processes suggest common triggering mechanisms and shared structural vulnerabilities. Environmental stress appears as a common factor across Late Bronze Age collapse, just as with Mesopotamian collapses. Paleoclimatic evidence from the Eastern Mediterranean region shows severe drought conditions during the 13th and 12th centuries BC. Marine sediment cores, lake-level reconstructions, and pollen records all indicate substantially reduced precipitation and increased aridity. The drought affected agricultural systems throughout the region, creating food shortages and economic stress. While the Late Bronze Age drought was not as severe as the Akkadian period event, it lasted longer with disrupted climate conditions persisting for over a century. The extended duration meant that affected civilizations could not recover during brief favourable intervals, as had sometimes been possible during shorter drought episodes. Trade network disruption features prominently in Late Bronze Age collapse, paralleling the commercial breakdown during Mesopotamian collapses. The Late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean functioned as an integrated economic system with extensive trade networks connecting diverse regions. Egypt imported timber, metals, and luxury goods from the Levant and Anatolia. Mycenaean Greece traded pottery and other goods throughout the Mediterranean. Cyprus served as a major copper source. The Hittite Empire controlled key trade routes through Anatolia. This complex trading system created interdependencies where disruptions in one region affected economies throughout the network. When multiple simultaneous stresses impacted different parts of the system, the cascading failures propagated throughout the entire network, causing widespread economic collapse. Population displacement and migration played crucial roles in late Bronze Age collapse, similar to the refugee movements documented in Mesopotamian sources. Egyptian texts from the period describe attacks by groups called Sea Peoples, who appear to have been displaced populations migrating from collapsing regions seeking new territories. These migrant groups attacked Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia, contributing to the destruction of multiple kingdoms. While Egyptian defences repelled Sea Peoples' attacks, the Hittite Empire and Mycenaean kingdoms proved unable to resist these migrations. The population movements represented responses to collapse conditions in original homelands, while simultaneously accelerating collapse in regions where migrants arrived. Administrative system collapse appears consistently across late Bronze Age civilizations, paralleling Mesopotamian bureaucratic breakdowns. Mycenaean palace societies maintained sophisticated administrative systems, documented through Linear B tablets. These texts reveal complex bureaucratic operations managing agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and labour allocation. When the palaces were destroyed around 1200 BC, the administrative systems disappeared completely. Linear B writing ceased to be used and was not recovered until modern decipherment. The loss of administrative capabilities meant that subsequent Greek societies operated at much lower organisational complexity for centuries, until new coordination mechanisms eventually developed. The classic Maya collapse provides an even more striking parallel to Mesopotamian collapse patterns, despite occurring in completely different geographical and cultural context. The Maya civilization of Central America reached its peak during the Classic period from approximately 300 to 900 AD, with major urban centres, sophisticated writing systems, advanced astronomical knowledge, and complex political organisation. During the 9th century AD, the southern Maya lowlands experienced catastrophic collapse, with major cities being abandoned, monument construction ceasing, and population declining by 80 to 90%. The collapse sequence and mechanisms closely parallel Mesopotamian patterns. Drought played the primary triggering role in Maya collapse, just as with Mesopotamian episodes. Paleoclimatic evidence from Central American lake sediments, cave deposits, and ocean cores demonstrates that severe drought conditions affected the Maya region during the 9th and 10th centuries AD. The terminal classic drought, as this event is known, reduced precipitation by approximately 40% compared to normal conditions. The drought proved especially devastating because it occurred after centuries of stable, favourable climate during which Maya populations had grown to levels that required maximum agricultural productivity. When drought reduced agricultural output, the dense populations faced immediate subsistence crises. Agricultural intensification and environmental degradation had created vulnerabilities in Maya society that paralleled problems in Mesopotamian civilizations. The Maya practiced complex agricultural systems, including terracing, raised field construction, and forest management that supported dense populations. However, these intensive systems required continuous maintenance and were vulnerable to disruption. Soil erosion, deforestation, and declining soil fertility had already reduced agricultural sustainability before the drought struck. The environmental degradation meant that Maya agricultural systems had less resilience to absorb drought impacts compared to earlier periods when environmental conditions were better. Political fragmentation and warfare intensification accompanied Maya collapse, just as with Mesopotamian breakdowns. As drought reduced agricultural productivity and created food shortages, competition between Maya city-states for remaining resources intensified into destructive warfare. monument inscriptions from the terminal Classic period document increasing military conflicts between rival kingdoms. The warfare damaged agricultural infrastructure, displaced populations, and diverted resources from productive activities. The combination of environmental stress and social conflict created downward spirals that overwhelmed Maya civilization's capacity for coordinated response. Administrative complexity and trade network dependence created vulnerabilities in Maya society that paralleled Mesopotamian fragilities. Maya city-states maintained sophisticated bureaucratic systems that coordinated agricultural production, craft manufacturing, construction projects, and long-distance trade. These complex systems required substantial resource surpluses to maintain operations. When drought reduced agricultural productivity, the surplus available to support administrative functions declined. As bureaucratic systems contracted, coordination capabilities deteriorated, creating cascading failures across interconnected social systems. Trade networks that had supplied jade, obsidian, and other materials essential for elite activities broke down as political instability made commercial travel dangerous. Knowledge loss accompanied Maya collapse, paralleling the intellectual regression documented in Mesopotamian contexts. The sophisticated Maya writing system was used extensively during the Classic period for recording historical events, astronomical observations, and administrative records. After the collapse, monument construction and hieroglyphic writing declined dramatically. Many cities abandoned writing entirely. When writing eventually recovered during the post-Classic period, it was used in much more limited ways. The astronomical and mathematical knowledge that Classic Maya scholars had developed was partially lost with subsequent societies, demonstrating reduced capabilities compared to Classic period achievements. The comparative analysis of Mesopotamian Late Bronze Age and Maya collapses reveals common structural features that create vulnerability in complex civilizations. All three cases show that environmental stress, particularly drought, can trigger collapse even in sophisticated societies with advanced technologies. All three demonstrate that trade network interdependencies create systemic vulnerabilities where disruptions propagate throughout entire systems. All three reveal that administrative complexity, while enabling coordination during normal conditions, can become source of fragility during stress periods. All three show that population growth during favourable periods creates demographic vulnerabilities when conditions deteriorate. The consistency of these patterns across different times, places and cultures suggests they reflect fundamental properties of complex civilizations rather than specific cultural failures. Modern systems theory provides analytical frameworks for understanding why Mesopotamian civilizations were vulnerable to the collapse patterns documented in ancient texts. Complex adaptive systems theory identifies how tightly coupled, hierarchically organized systems with high coordination requirements become increasingly fragile as they grow more sophisticated. Mesopotamian irrigation-based agriculture created tight coupling between environmental conditions, hydraulic infrastructure, administrative coordination, and social stability. Disruption to any component of this tightly integrated system could trigger cascading failures across all domains. The efficiency that made Sumerian civilization productive during normal conditions became a source of fragility during stress events, when the system lacked the redundancy and flexibility to absorb disruptions without catastrophic failure. Systems theory analysis begins by recognizing that complex civilizations function as integrated systems composed of multiple interacting subsystems, including environmental, economic, political, and social components. These subsystems are not independent but connected through multiple feedback loops and dependencies. Changes in one subsystem propagate to others through these connections. When systems are loosely coupled with substantial buffers and redundancies, disruptions in one subsystem can be absorbed without affecting others. However, as systems become more complex and optimized for efficiency, coupling typically tightens and buffers decline, making the overall system more vulnerable to cascading failures. Mesopotamian irrigation agriculture exemplifies tight coupling between multiple system components. Agricultural productivity depended on water availability from rivers. Water distribution required hydraulic infrastructure including canals, dikes, and regulators. Infrastructure maintenance demanded coordinated labour mobilisation. Labour coordination required functioning administrative systems. Administrative operations needed agricultural surplus for support. Each component depended critically on others, creating a tightly coupled system where failure of any component could trigger failures throughout the entire system. During drought periods when water availability declined, all these interdependencies became vulnerabilities as reduced water triggered agricultural decline, which reduced surplus, which undermined administration, which prevented infrastructure maintenance, which further reduced agricultural productivity. The hierarchical organization of Mesopotamian political and administrative systems created additional vulnerabilities through centralization of decision-making and coordination functions. The complex bureaucratic systems that managed agricultural production, labor allocation, and resource distribution required central coordination to function effectively. Local officials received directives from higher authorities and reported upward through administrative hierarchies. This centralized structure enabled sophisticated coordination during normal conditions, but created single points of failure during crises. When central authorities lost capacity to coordinate due to resource constraints or communication breakdowns, the entire administrative system lost functionality. Lower-level officials could not coordinate independently without higher authority direction, leading to rapid collapse of coordination capabilities. The optimization of Mesopotamian economic systems for maximum productivity during normal conditions reduced resilience during stress periods. Agricultural systems were designed to maximize yields through intensive irrigation and monocrop cultivation. This approach produced high outputs when conditions remained favorable, but left little margin for error. Systems optimized for maximum efficiency typically sacrifice redundancy and flexibility that provide resilience during disruptions. Mesopotamian agricultural systems had little excess capacity to draw upon when drought reduced primary production. The lack of diversification in crops and production methods meant that when irrigation-dependent cereal agriculture failed, few alternatives existed to maintain food supplies. Network theory provides additional frameworks for understanding Mesopotamian trade vulnerabilities. Trade networks function as complex systems where nodes representing cities or regions are connected by links representing commercial relationships. Network robustness depends partly on connectivity patterns. Highly centralized networks with few critical nodes that handle most traffic are vulnerable to targeted disruptions. Mesopotamian trade networks exhibited hub-and-spoke patterns, with major cities serving as central hubs connecting multiple peripheral regions. This structure enabled efficient commerce during normal conditions but created vulnerabilities where disruption of major hub cities could disconnect entire regions from trade networks. The collapse of major urban centers during crisis periods effectively destroyed trade networks rather than merely disrupting them temporarily. Resilience theory examines how systems respond to disturbances and identifies factors that determine whether systems recover their original functions or transition to alternative stable states. Resilient systems can absorb substantial disturbances while maintaining core functions and recovering original operating conditions once disturbances end. Systems lacking resilience may experience regime shifts where disturbances trigger transitions to fundamentally different operating modes that persist even after original disturbances end. Mesopotamian collapse episodes demonstrate regime shift dynamics where disturbances triggered transitions to lower complexity states that persisted for centuries, despite eventual stabilization of environmental conditions. The inability to rapidly recover original functions reflects fundamental loss of resilience in social and economic systems. The concept of adaptive cycles helps explain the cyclical pattern of Mesopotamian history. Adaptive cycle theory proposes that complex systems move through recurring phases including growth and exploitation, conservation and connectedness, collapse and release, and reorganization and renewal. During growth phases, systems become more complex, interconnected, and optimized for efficiency. This phase generates increasing productivity and prosperity, but accumulates hidden vulnerabilities through reduced flexibility and resilience. Eventually, disturbances that might have been manageable during earlier phases trigger collapse when accumulated vulnerabilities exceed adaptive capacity. The collapse releases locked-up resources and destroys rigid structures, enabling reorganization and renewal, but at lower complexity levels. Mesopotamian history shows multiple adaptive cycles, with growth phases creating vulnerable optimized systems that eventually collapsed when environmental or social stresses exceeded resilience thresholds. Threshold and tipping point concepts explain why Mesopotamian systems often collapsed rapidly rather than gradually degrading. Complex systems typically exhibit threshold behaviors where gradual changes in conditions produce little response until critical thresholds are crossed, triggering rapid state changes. Mesopotamian agricultural systems could tolerate modest droughts through adjustments in irrigation management, crop selection, and resource allocation. However, severe droughts exceeded threshold levels where adaptive responses proved insufficient, triggering rapid agricultural collapse. Once thresholds were crossed, positive feedback loops accelerated collapse processes. Agricultural decline reduced administrative capacity, which prevented effective response, which further reduced agricultural output, creating downward spirals that were difficult to reverse. Path dependency concepts help explain why collapsed Mesopotamian civilizations found recovery difficult. Once systems enter particular states, subsequent trajectories become constrained by past conditions, creating path dependencies that make certain outcomes difficult or impossible to achieve. Mesopotamian knowledge loss during collapses created path dependencies, where recovery societies started from reduced capability baselines. The permanent loss of infrastructure, skills, and social capital meant that post-collapse societies could not simply resume previous trajectories, but had to develop along different paths from lower starting points. This path dependency explains why full recovery to pre-collapse sophistication levels often proved impossible with successor civilizations operating at permanently reduced complexity compared to their predecessors. Beyond the climate-driven droughts documented in collapse narratives, Sumerian civilization faced chronic resource depletion problems that accumulated over centuries and increased vulnerability to collapse triggers. Soil salinization caused by intensive irrigation, agriculture represented an especially severe long-term problem. As irrigation water evaporated from fields, dissolved salts accumulated in the soil, gradually reducing agricultural productivity. Administrative tablets from the Ur 3-period document declining crop yields and increasing fallow periods required to restore field productivity, indicating that salinization was already creating serious problems before the final collapse. Archaeological soil analysis from ancient agricultural zones shows salt accumulation levels that would have made sustained farming increasingly difficult over time, creating a chronic resource stress that weakened resilience against additional shocks. The process of soil salinization in irrigation agriculture follows predictable mechanisms that were well understood by ancient Mesopotamian agriculturalists, even if they lacked modern chemical terminology to describe the phenomena. Irrigation water drawn from rivers contains dissolved salts at relatively low concentrations. When this water is applied to fields, plants absorb pure water while leaving salts behind in the soil. As water evaporates from the soil surface and through plant transpiration, salt concentrations in the remaining soil moisture increase. Over repeated irrigation cycles, salts accumulate in the soil profile, reaching concentrations that inhibit plant growth and eventually make cultivation impossible without remediation. The severity of salinization in Mesopotamian agriculture resulted from the combination of intensive irrigation practices with environmental conditions that promoted rapid salt accumulation. The hot-dry climate of Mesopotamia created high evaporation rates that concentrated salts rapidly. The flat topography of the Mesopotamian plain provided poor natural drainage, meaning that salts had difficulty moving through soil profiles to be flushed away. The irrigation techniques used by Sumerian farmers involved flooding fields with water that then evaporated, leaving salt deposits. The intensity of agricultural production, with fields being cultivated continuously, or with minimal fallow periods, prevented natural salt dilution through rainfall leaching that occurs in non-irrigated agriculture. Documentary evidence of salinization problems appears clearly in Earth III administrative texts that track agricultural productivity over time. Harvest records from temple estates show declining yields measured in grain volume per unit of cultivated area. Earlier III texts from the reign of Ur-Nammu record average barley yields of approximately 2,400 litres per hectare. By the reign of Ibbi-Sin, 4 decades later, yields from the same estates had declined to approximately 1,600 litres per hectare, a reduction of 33%. While some of this decline may reflect drought conditions, the gradual nature of the reduction and its appearance across multiple estates suggests chronic soil degradation rather than acute climate stress. The administrative responses to declining productivity documented in agricultural texts reveal that Mesopotamian land managers recognized soil degradation problems and attempted various remediation strategies. Texts describe increasing use of fallow periods where fields were left uncultivated to allow soil recovery. Earlier III texts show typical fallow periods of 1 year in 4 or 5. Later texts describe fallow periods extending to 1 year in 3 or even 1 year in 2, indicating that more extended rest periods were necessary to maintain any productivity. The increasing fallow requirements meant that larger total field areas were needed to maintain constant food production levels. However, the expansion of cultivated area was limited by water availability and suitable land constraints, making it impossible to fully compensate for per-hectare productivity declines. Archaeological soil analysis from ancient Mesopotamian agricultural zones provides direct physical evidence of salt accumulation that confirms the documentary record. Surveys conducted by Thorkild Jacobsen and Robert Adams during the 1950s collected soil samples from areas that were intensively cultivated during ancient periods. Chemical analysis of these samples revealed salt concentrations in surface soils ranging from 0.5 to 2.0% by weight. These concentration levels fall within ranges that severely inhibit barley growth and make wheat cultivation essentially impossible. The spatial distribution of high salinity soils corresponds precisely with areas documented in ancient texts as intensive agricultural zones, confirming that salinization resulted from irrigation agriculture rather than natural processes. The crop choice shifts documented in agricultural texts provide additional evidence of salinization impacts. Early Mesopotamian agriculture grew both wheat and barley, with wheat often being preferred for human consumption. However, barley has substantially higher salt tolerance than wheat and can produce some yields in saline conditions where wheat completely fails. Agricultural records from the early dynastic period around 2700 BC show wheat comprising approximately 15 to 20% of total grain production. By the Ur III period, wheat had declined to less than 2% of documented harvests, with barley dominating almost completely. This dramatic shift reflects adaptation to increasingly saline soil conditions that made wheat cultivation impractical across most agricultural zones. The long-term trajectory of salinization created chronic stress that progressively weakened Mesopotamian agricultural systems, making them increasingly vulnerable to additional shocks. Even without drought, gradually declining yields required either expansion of cultivated area or acceptance of reduced total production. Both responses had negative consequences. Area expansion required extending irrigation networks into more marginal lands with poorer soils or less reliable water access. Production reduction meant smaller surpluses available to support urban populations and governmental operations. When severe drought struck agricultural systems already stressed by salinization, the combined impacts proved catastrophic, where either stress alone might have been manageable. The irreversibility of severe salinization created permanent reductions in agricultural capacity that persisted long after other collapse factors resolved. Salt removal from soils requires either extensive fresh water flushing, which demands water volumes exceeding normal irrigation requirements, or installation of drainage systems that allow salt-laden water to exit fields, which require substantial engineering work. Ancient Mesopotamian farmers lacked the resources to implement either a mediation approach at necessary scales. Once fields became too saline for cultivation, they typically remained unusable for agricultural production, even after political and economic recovery enabled resumption of farming in less degraded areas. Archaeological surveys show that many zones intensively cultivated during the Earth-3 period remained abandoned or very sparsely used during subsequent Old Babylonian and later periods, indicating permanent loss of agricultural capacity. The salinization problem demonstrates how successful civilizations can create conditions that undermine their own long-term sustainability through the cumulative impacts of practices that appear beneficial in the short term. Intensive irrigation agriculture enabled the high productivity that supported Sumerian urban civilization and population growth. However, this same intensive agriculture caused progressive soil degradation that guaranteed eventual agricultural decline. The timescales involved meant that salinization impacts accumulated slowly over centuries, making the problem difficult to recognize and address before it became severe. By the time yield declines became obvious, salinization had already progressed to levels requiring major remediation efforts beyond the capacity of ancient technologies. Sumerian collapse narratives rarely mention population growth as a problem, but administrative records reveal demographic trends that increased societal vulnerability. Ration texts from the Ur-3 period document enormous urban populations dependent on imported food from agricultural hinterlands. As long as trade networks, irrigation systems, and administrative coordination functioned effectively, these dense urban populations could be sustained. However, this demographic concentration created severe vulnerability to any disruption of food supply systems. When agricultural productivity declined during drought periods, dense urban populations faced immediate subsistence crises that could not be resolved through internal adjustments. The demographic structure of Sumerian civilization amplified the impact of resource stress, transforming manageable agricultural shortfalls into civilization-threatening catastrophes. The population growth that occurred during stable periods of Mesopotamian history created demographic conditions that increased vulnerability during subsequent stress periods. Archaeological surveys tracking settlement patterns over time reveal that population levels grew substantially during politically unified periods with effective administration. The early dynastic period saw population growth as agricultural intensification enabled support for larger numbers. The Akkadian unification enabled further growth through improved security and trade. The Ur-3 period represented peak population levels for ancient southern Mesopotamia, with settlement surveys indicating that virtually all potentially cultivable land was under intensive agricultural production, and urban centres reached their maximum extents. The urban concentration that characterised Ur-3 demographic structure created particular vulnerabilities. Large cities including Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and Lagash supported populations measured in tens of thousands of inhabitants. These urban populations were not agriculturally self-sufficient, but depended entirely on food imported from rural hinterlands, often located considerable distances away. The provisioning systems that sustained urban populations required functioning transportation networks, administrative coordination of food collection and distribution, and sufficient agricultural surplus to support substantial non-farming populations. Any disruption to these provisioning systems immediately threatened urban populations with food shortages. Ration texts from Ur-3 archives document the scale of urban provisioning requirements with quantitative precision. The archives from Drehem and Pusurish Dagon that coordinated livestock distribution processed tens of thousands of animals monthly for urban consumption. Grain ration texts from document daily distributions to thousands of workers, soldiers, and temple personnel. The quantities involved reveal that major cities consumed food production from vast agricultural territories. Estimates based on documented ration levels and urban population sizes suggest that a city of 30,000 inhabitants required grain production from approximately 12,000 hectares of agricultural land, assuming average UR 3-period yields. Supporting the entire urban population of southern Mesopotamia required nearly all agricultural production from the region, with minimal surplus remaining as buffer against production shortfalls. The lack of significant food storage capacity in Mesopotamian cities intensified vulnerability to supply disruptions. Unlike civilizations that maintained multi-year grain reserves, Mesopotamian cities appear to have operated with relatively limited storage. Archaeological excavations reveal that storage facilities in cities could hold perhaps several months of consumption at normal rates, but not the multi-year reserves that might buffer against extended production failures. The limited storage meant that when agricultural yields declined, urban populations quickly faced actual food shortages rather than merely drawing down strategic reserves. The immediacy of subsistence crises when supply disruptions occurred left little time for adaptive responses or emergency interventions. The demographic concentration in cities created social and political pressures during food shortage periods that accelerated collapse dynamics. Urban populations facing hunger had limited options for self-provisioning, unlike rural agricultural populations who could at least consume seed grain or slaughter livestock as desperate measures. The concentration of powerful institutions, including palaces, temples, and wealthy elite households in cities, meant that competition for diminishing food supplies involved groups with capacity for organized violence. Food riots and internal conflicts during shortage periods are documented in collapse narratives describing urban disorder. The political instability generated by urban food crises undermined governmental capacity to coordinate responses precisely when effective administration was most needed. The carrying capacity concept from ecology helps explain demographic vulnerability. Carrying capacity represents the maximum population that an environment can sustainably support, given available resources and technologies. Mesopotamian agricultural systems during favourable climate periods with well-maintained irrigation infrastructure could support the high population levels documented during the Ur 3 period. However, this carrying capacity was not stable, but varied with environmental conditions and infrastructure status. When drought reduced agricultural productivity, carrying capacity declined, potentially falling below actual population levels. The demographic overshoot relative to reduced carrying capacity guaranteed population reduction through some combination of mortality, migration, or fertility decline. The mechanisms of demographic adjustment during collapse periods involved all three possible responses to carrying capacity overshoot. Mortality increased through starvation, disease, and violence, as documented in skeletal remains from collapse contexts. Migration dispersed populations from urban centres that could no longer be sustained to peripheral regions with better survival prospects. Fertility declined as nutritional stress, social disruption, and economic insecurity reduced reproduction rates. The combined effects of these mechanisms reduced population levels by 50% or more compared to pre-collapse peaks, with urban areas experiencing even larger proportional declines. The time required for demographic recovery after collapse extended well beyond the periods needed for environmental and political stabilization. Even after drought conditions ended and political order was re-established, population growth from reduced post-collapse baselines took many generations. Demographic modelling based on ancient population growth rates suggests that recovery from 50% population reduction would require at least a century, even under favourable conditions. The extended demographic recovery periods help explain why post-collapse civilizations remained at reduced complexity levels for centuries before eventually approaching pre-collapse sophistication. The relationship between population pressure and resource stress created positive feedback loops that accelerated collapse once demographic levels exceeded sustainable thresholds. High populations required intensive resource exploitation, which caused environmental degradation, including salinization and deforestation, which reduced carrying capacity, which increased resource stress, which triggered social conflict, which damaged infrastructure, which further reduced productivity. Breaking these feedback loops required either reducing population to sustainable levels or substantially increasing resource availability or productivity, neither of which could be achieved rapidly given ancient technological constraints. While environmental and economic factors receive primary emphasis in collapse narratives, political factors, including elite competition and succession conflicts, also contributed to civilizational breakdown. Administrative texts from the final years of the Third Dynasty reveal increasing conflicts between royal authority and temple establishments over resource control. As overall resource availability declined, competition intensified between different elite factions seeking to maintain their positions. This internal political conflict diverted resources from essential infrastructure maintenance and weakened coordination capabilities precisely when effective collective action was most needed. The political fragmentation that followed collapse episodes represents not merely a symptom of breakdown, but an active contributor to the cascading failures that destroyed centralized states. The political structure of earthly Mesopotamia concentrated enormous power and wealth in royal and temple establishments that controlled most productive resources. The king and palace administration managed extensive agricultural estates, controlled long-distance trade, directed craft production, and commanded military forces. Temple establishments similarly controlled vast properties, operated economic enterprises, and employed thousands of personnel. The concentration of resources in these elite institutions created potential for conflicts over resource allocation and institutional prerogatives that intensified during resource scarcity conditions. Evidence of increasing tension between royal and temple authorities appears in administrative texts from the final decades of the Ur-3 dynasty. Early texts from the reign of Shulgi show collaborative relationships with temple establishments, receiving royal support and cooperating in state administrative systems. Later texts from the time of Ibisin reveal conflicts over resource control. Royal officials attempted to appropriate temple revenues for palace use. Temple administrators resisted these appropriations and sought to maintain institutional autonomy. The disputes involved substantial resources that both institutions required to maintain operations during increasingly difficult economic conditions. Succession conflicts within the royal family created additional political instability during the late Ur-3 period. The transition from Shusin to Ibisin appears to have involved disputed succession, with some texts suggesting multiple claimants to royal authority. Succession disputes diverted elite attention and resources away from addressing environmental and economic crises. Military forces that should have been defending against external threats or maintaining internal order were instead mobilized to support competing royal claimants. The political uncertainty surrounding succession undermined confidence in governmental stability and weakened administrative effectiveness. Regional governors and provincial administrators exploited central government weakness during crisis periods to assert greater autonomy or outright independence. Administrative correspondence from the late Ur-3 period documents cases of provincial officials refusing to remit tax revenues, declining to provide labour contingents for public works, or ignoring royal directives. The central government lacked the resources and authority to compel compliance from distant provinces. The progressive loss of provincial control reduced the resource base available to the central administration, creating downward spiral where governmental weakness encouraged further provincial defection, which further weakened the government. elite competition for diminishing resources created conflicts that damaged essential infrastructure and disrupted coordination systems. Disputes over water rights led to sabotage of irrigation infrastructure as competing factions attempted to monopolize limited water resources. Competition for agricultural land produced violence that displaced farming populations and left fields uncultivated. Conflicts over trade revenues disrupted commercial networks as different factions attempted to control trade routes and tax commerce. Each of these conflicts reduced overall resource availability while directing existing resources toward destructive rather than productive purposes. The political fragmentation that accelerated during late Earth III and early Isan-Lhasa periods reflected elite adaptation to collapse conditions through assertion of local autonomy and resource control. As central government capacity declined, regional elites found it advantageous to withdraw from the failing state system and establish independent power bases. Local governors declared independence as kings of their provinces. Temple administrators asserted control over temple estates free from royal oversight. Military commanders established autonomous power bases using their troop contingents. The fragmentation that resulted destroyed the coordination systems that had enabled large-scale political integration. The relationship between resource stress and elite competition followed patterns predictable from political economy theory. During periods of abundant resources, elite groups can coexist relatively peacefully with sufficient surplus to satisfy multiple powerful factions. When resources decline, elite competition intensifies as different groups struggle to maintain their positions despite shrinking overall resource pools. This intensified competition can become destructive when groups prioritize their relative positions over collective welfare. Elite conflicts during Mesopotamian collapse periods exhibited this destructive dynamic, with factions fighting over diminishing resources rather than cooperating to address underlying resource crises. The institutional structures of Mesopotamian states lacked effective mechanisms for managing elite conflicts during resource stress periods. The concentration of power in royal and temple establishments created binary conflicts where institutional prerogatives of major actors were at stake. The absence of formal frameworks for negotiating resource allocation during scarcity left elites to resolve disputes through informal political maneuvering or outright conflict. The personalistic nature of elite relationships meant that conflicts often became personal feuds rather than negotiable disputes over policy. These structural features of Mesopotamian political systems made elite conflict resolution particularly difficult during crisis periods. The military dimension of elite competition consumed resources desperately needed for productive purposes. Military forces that had been employed during stable periods for external defense or territorial expansion were redirected during crisis periods toward internal conflicts between elite factions. The costs of maintaining military forces increased as competition intensified, while the resources available to support them declined. The diversion of labour from agriculture to military service reduced food production. The destruction caused by internal military conflicts damaged infrastructure and disrupted economic activities. The military aspects of elite competition thus contributed directly to cascading failures across economic systems. The self-reinforcing nature of elite competition dynamics helped explain why political conflicts often continued even after they became obviously counterproductive. Once conflicts began, each faction faced incentives to continue fighting to avoid appearing weak or losing positions to rivals. The sunk costs of resources already committed to conflicts made withdrawal psychologically difficult, even when rational analysis suggested that continued fighting was futile. The personal animosities developed during conflicts became obstacles to reconciliation, even when objective conditions called for cooperation. These psychological and social factors locked elite groups into destructive conflict patterns that persisted until complete systemic collapse eliminated the stakes they had been fighting over. The fact that detailed accounts of collapse survived and continued to be copied for over 1,000 years after the events they described demonstrate sophisticated historical consciousness among Mesopotamian scribal communities. These texts functioned as more than historical records or religious literature. They served as educational tools teaching future administrators and rulers about the vulnerabilities of complex civilizations and the factors that could trigger collapse. The scribal schools that trained bureaucratic elites across multiple dynasties ensured that knowledge of past failures remained available to inform contemporary policy. This institutional preservation of collapse knowledge represents a form of cultural adaptation, creating historical memory that could potentially help societies avoid repeating previous failures. The institutional mechanisms through which collapse knowledge was preserved demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the importance of maintaining historical memory across generations. Scribal schools operated as the primary vehicles for transmitting collapse narratives through their role in training literate elites. The curriculum of Mesopotamian scribal education included extensive study of classical texts that preserved collapse accounts. Students spent years copying and memorizing literary works including city laments, historical chronicles, and theological texts that documented ancient disasters. This educational practice ensured that every generation of trained scribes possessed detailed knowledge of previous collapse episodes. The specific texts selected for inclusion in scribal curricula reveal deliberate choices about which historical memories should be preserved and transmitted. The Curse of Akkad, despite being composed centuries after the events it described, was continuously copied and studied throughout Mesopotamian history. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur became a literary model that influenced composition of later city laments. The Sumerian king list, with its documentation of multiple dynastic transitions, including collapse episodes, served as foundational historical knowledge. The consistent copying and study of these specific texts across different political periods and dynasties indicates that scribal communities valued collapse narratives as essential knowledge that should be maintained regardless of changing political circumstances. The literary analysis practices applied to collapse narratives in scribal schools suggest that these texts were studied for their substantive content about collapse mechanisms rather than merely memorized as cultural artifacts. Scholastic commentaries on collapse texts that survive from later periods demonstrate that scribes analyzed the narratives to extract lessons about causation and consequences. Questions posed in school texts include inquiries about why specific kings failed, what mistakes led to urban destruction, and how divine displeasure was provoked. The analytical approach to collapse narratives indicates they functioned as case studies for understanding civilizational vulnerability rather than merely preserving historical information. The geographic distribution of collapse narrative manuscripts demonstrates that this knowledge was widely disseminated throughout Mesopotamian civilization rather than restricted to central institutions. Tablets containing collapse texts have been discovered at numerous sites throughout Mesopotamia, including major capitals, provincial administrative centres, and smaller towns with scribal schools. The wide distribution suggests that collapse knowledge was considered sufficiently important to merit dissemination throughout the entire literate class. Local scribal schools in provincial settings included the same collapse narratives in their curricula as major urban centres, ensuring that knowledge of civilizational vulnerability reached administrators throughout governmental systems. The multilingual transmission of collapse knowledge through translation into Akkadian from original Sumerian texts expanded the audience for these narratives and ensured their continued relevance as linguistic practices evolved. The Sumerian language gradually ceased to be spoken during the 2nd millennium BC, but continued as a literary language maintained by scribal schools. Akkadian translations of Sumerian collapse narratives made these texts accessible to administrators who knew Akkadian but lacked extensive Sumerian training. The translation efforts demonstrate commitment to preserving collapse knowledge, even as cultural and linguistic contexts changed, requiring adaptation of transmission methods. The incorporation of collapse narratives into royal inscription traditions indicates that political authorities recognize the value of historical knowledge for contemporary governance. Kings referenced ancient collapses in their own inscriptions to demonstrate awareness of civilizational vulnerabilities and to present their policies as avoiding previous mistakes. Sargon II of Assyria referenced the fall of earlier dynasties to emphasize his restoration of proper governance. Nebuchadnezzar II referenced ancient destructions of Babylon to legitimize his reconstruction projects. The political use of collapse narratives demonstrates that historical memory functioned as practical political knowledge rather than merely academic interest. The practical applications of collapse knowledge appear in policy decisions documented in administrative texts that show awareness of vulnerabilities revealed through historical study. Royal investment in irrigation infrastructure maintenance reflects understanding derived from collapse narratives that hydraulic system failure contributed to ancient disasters. Legal codes regulating water rights demonstrate recognition that resource conflicts could escalate into destructive social breakdown. Administrative efforts to maintain grain reserves show awareness that food security was crucial for preventing urban crises. These policy choices suggest that collapse knowledge influenced actual governance practices and was not merely theoretical knowledge without practical application. The transmission of collapse knowledge beyond Mesopotamian civilization into neighboring cultures demonstrates the perceived value of this historical memory. Hittite texts reference Mesopotamian historical traditions, including collapse narratives. Hebrew biblical literature incorporates themes and imagery from Mesopotamian collapse accounts, particularly flood narratives. Greek historians drew on Mesopotamian sources when describing ancient Near Eastern history. The cross-cultural transmission of collapse knowledge indicates that its value extended beyond specific Mesopotamian context to inform understanding of civilizational dynamics in diverse cultural settings. The failure of collapse knowledge to prevent repetition of collapse cycles despite its preservation and study reveals limitations of historical consciousness as protective mechanism against systemic vulnerabilities. Mesopotamian civilization experienced multiple collapse episodes despite maintaining detailed knowledge of previous failures. The knowledge was preserved and transmitted but proved insufficient to enable avoidance of conditions that triggered repeated breakdowns. This historical pattern demonstrates that understanding collapse mechanisms, while necessary for preventing recurrence, is not sufficient if underlying structural vulnerabilities persist, and if political will or technical capacity to address vulnerabilities remains inadequate. The collapse patterns documented in Sumerian texts offer important lessons for understanding vulnerabilities in contemporary civilization. Modern societies exhibit many of the same structural characteristics that made Mesopotamian civilizations fragile: high coordination requirements, tight coupling between critical systems, dependence on complex infrastructure networks, resource optimization that reduces resilience, and political institutions struggling to coordinate collective responses to long-term challenges. The Sumerian experience demonstrates that sophisticated civilizations are not immune to catastrophic failure, and that collapse can occur despite high technological capability and complex institutional structures. Understanding the specific mechanisms through which ancient civilizations broke down provides crucial insights for identifying and addressing comparable vulnerabilities in contemporary systems. The parallels between ancient Mesopotamian vulnerabilities and contemporary challenges are sufficiently detailed to merit careful attention from researchers and policymakers concerned with civilizational resilience. Contemporary global civilization depends on tightly coupled infrastructure systems including electrical grids, communication networks, transportation systems, and financial networks. These infrastructures exhibit the same tight coupling characteristics that made Mesopotamian irrigation systems vulnerable, with disruptions in one domain rapidly cascading to others. The 2003 electrical blackout that affected 50 million people across northeastern North America demonstrates how tightly coupled electrical grids can experience cascading failures. The 2008 financial crisis showed how tightly coupled global financial systems can collapse when critical institutions fail. The environmental dependencies that made Mesopotamian civilization vulnerable to drought have direct parallels in contemporary dependence on stable climate conditions. Modern agriculture depends on consistent precipitation patterns, stable temperatures, and reliable water supplies. Climate change threatens to disrupt these conditions, creating agricultural stresses comparable to the droughts that triggered Mesopotamian collapses. The California drought from 2012 to 2016 demonstrated how even technologically advanced societies struggle to maintain agricultural productivity when water availability declined substantially. The ongoing depletion of groundwater aquifers creates vulnerabilities comparable to ancient irrigation system degradation. The resource depletion issues that weakened ancient civilizations through processes like salinization have contemporary equivalents in phenomena including soil degradation, aquifer depletion, and fossil fuel extraction. Intensive modern agriculture causes soil erosion and nutrient depletion that reduce long-term productivity, similar to how ancient irrigation caused salinization. The depletion of fossil groundwater from aquifers that accumulated over millennia parallels the unsustainable water use that contributed to Mesopotamian agricultural decline. The dependence on finite fossil fuel resources creates vulnerabilities as these resources deplete and must be replaced with alternative energy sources requiring massive infrastructure transitions. The demographic vulnerabilities that amplified resource stress in Mesopotamian civilization have parallels in contemporary population distributions and growth patterns. Modern urban populations depend on complex supply chains that deliver food and resources from distant production zones. The provisioning systems that sustain contemporary cities are more sophisticated than ancient systems, but exhibit similar vulnerabilities to disruption. Urban populations have minimal capacity for self-provisioning during supply disruptions. The concentration of populations in coastal zones threatened by sea level rise creates vulnerabilities comparable to Mesopotamian concentration in drought-vulnerable regions. Global population approaching 8 billion creates pressure on resources and ecosystems that parallels the population pressures documented in pre-collapse Mesopotamian administrative texts. The political dynamics that contributed to Mesopotamian collapse through elite competition and coordination failures appear in contemporary political systems struggling to address long-term challenges. Modern political institutions often prioritize short-term considerations over long-term sustainability, reflecting similar biases documented in ancient administrative priorities. Elite competition in contemporary societies involves struggles over diminishing resource access and political power that parallel ancient elite conflicts. The difficulty of achieving international cooperation on challenges like climate change demonstrates coordination problems comparable to the failures of Mesopotamian city-states to cooperate during crisis periods. The knowledge transmission challenges that limited effectiveness of ancient collapse knowledge have parallels in contemporary difficulties, translating scientific knowledge into policy action. Modern civilization possesses extensive scientific understanding of climate change, resource depletion, and environmental degradation, but struggles to implement responses adequate to the scale of challenges. The gap between knowledge and action in contemporary society mirrors the gap evident in Mesopotamian history, where preserved collapse knowledge proved insufficient to prevent repeated failures. The psychological, political, and institutional barriers that prevent effective response to long-term threats operate similarly across ancient and modern contexts. The systems theory insights developed through analysis of Mesopotamian collapse provide analytical frameworks applicable to contemporary vulnerabilities. The concepts of tight coupling, cascading failures, threshold effects, and resilience loss apply to modern infrastructure and social systems as clearly as to ancient civilizations. The understanding that optimized systems sacrifice resilience for efficiency applies to modern just-in-time supply chains, minimal inventory management, and other efficiency-maximizing practices that reduce buffers against disruption. The recognition that complex hierarchical systems can fail catastrophically when central coordination collapses applies to contemporary globalized systems dependent on international institutions and coordination mechanisms. The historical perspective provided by Mesopotamian collapse challenges assumptions about the permanence and inevitability of complex civilization. Modern societies often implicitly assume that technological advancement and institutional sophistication provide immunity against catastrophic collapse. The Mesopotamian experience demonstrates that sophisticated civilizations can fail completely despite their capabilities. The centuries-long dark ages that followed Mesopotamian collapses, during which much knowledge was lost and social complexity declined, dramatically show that collapse can produce severe and lasting setbacks. The historical evidence argues against complacency and for serious attention to civilizational vulnerabilities. The specific mechanisms of Mesopotamian collapse provide actionable insights for contemporary resilience planning. The importance of maintaining infrastructure redundancy and buffers against disruption. The need for coordination mechanisms that can function during resource stress. The value of maintaining knowledge and skills that might become crucial during crisis periods. The importance of addressing long-term resource sustainability issues before they create critical vulnerabilities. The need for political institutions capable of making difficult decisions about resource allocation and collective welfare. Each of these lessons, derived from ancient experience, has direct application to contemporary challenges. The ultimate lesson from Sumerian collapse narratives may be recognition that civilizational collapse is possible, has occurred repeatedly throughout history, and represents an ongoing risk that requires active management rather than passive assumption of continued progress. The Mesopotamian texts preserved across millennia document this recognition and the attempts to learn from experience. Contemporary civilization faces comparable challenges with arguably higher stakes, given global population levels and technological capabilities. Whether modern societies can learn from ancient experience and implement more effective responses to civilizational vulnerabilities remains an open question that will shape the future trajectory of human civilization. The evidence presented throughout this investigation reveals a profound pattern that challenges conventional assumptions about the inevitability of civilizational progress and the permanence of human achievements. The Sumerian collapse narratives, preserved in cuneiform tablets for over 3 millennia, document not isolated disasters but recurring cycles of rise and catastrophic breakdown that characterize Mesopotamian civilization across its entire history. These cycles followed remarkably consistent patterns, with environmental stress triggering agricultural failure, administrative systems collapsing under resource constraints, social conflicts intensifying, populations dispersing, knowledge disappearing, and technological capabilities regressing to levels substantially below previous achievements. The precision with which ancient texts documented these processes and the archaeological evidence confirming their accounts demonstrate that Mesopotamian observers possess sophisticated understanding of the mechanisms through which complex civilizations fail. The convergence of evidence across multiple domains establishes that these collapse episodes resulted from fundamental structural vulnerabilities inherent in the organization of Mesopotamian civilization, rather than random historical accidents or simple military defeats. The tight coupling between irrigation agriculture and administrative coordination created systems where disruptions cascaded across all domains simultaneously. The optimization for maximum productivity during favorable conditions eliminated the redundancy and flexibility necessary for resilience during stress periods. The concentration of populations in urban centres dependent on distant agricultural production created demographic vulnerabilities that amplified resource stress. The hierarchical political structures concentrated coordination functions in ways that created catastrophic single points of failure. These structural features enabled Mesopotamian civilization to achieve remarkable sophistication and prosperity during stable periods, but guaranteed vulnerability to systemic collapse when combinations of stresses exceeded adaptive capacity. The cyclical repetition of collapse across multiple dynasties, despite preservation of detailed knowledge about previous failures, reveals sobering limitations of historical consciousness as protection against systemic vulnerabilities. Mesopotamian scribal schools maintained and transmitted collapse narratives for over 1,000 years, ensuring that educated elites possessed detailed understanding of how previous civilizations had fallen. Yet this knowledge proved insufficient to prevent subsequent societies from experiencing similar breakdowns when comparable stress conditions appeared. The persistence of underlying structural vulnerabilities overcame the advantages that historical awareness might have provided. Political institutions lacked capacity or will to implement changes necessary to address fundamental fragilities. The benefits of vulnerable systems during normal times created incentives to maintain rather than reform them despite known risks. The parallels between ancient Mesopotamian vulnerabilities and contemporary global civilization extend far beyond superficial similarities to encompass fundamental structural characteristics. Modern societies exhibit the same tight coupling between critical infrastructure systems, the same optimization for efficiency at the expense of resilience, the same demographic concentrations in vulnerable locations, the same political difficulties coordinating responses to long-term challenges, and the same resource dependencies that can become catastrophic vulnerabilities during disruption. The Sumerian experience demonstrates that technological sophistication and institutional complexity provide no immunity against collapse, and that civilizational breakdown can occur rapidly once threshold conditions are exceeded and cascading failures begin. The ultimate significance of Sumerian collapse knowledge for contemporary humanity lies not in the specific details of ancient agricultural failures or bureaucratic breakdowns, but in the fundamental recognition that civilizational collapse represents an ongoing possibility requiring active management. The preservation of collapse narratives across millennia reflects ancient understanding that this knowledge might prove crucial for future survival. Modern civilization possesses far more sophisticated analytical tools and vastly greater technological capabilities than ancient Mesopotamia, but faces challenges of comparable magnitude operating on global rather than regional scales. Whether contemporary societies can learn from ancient experience and implement more effective responses to civilizational vulnerabilities will determine whether we avoid repeating the cycles of catastrophic breakdown that the Sumerian tablets so carefully documented for posterity.